Aye. Alive again? Then show me where he is. I'll give £1,000 to look upon him. Shakespeare. In the autumn of 1816, John Melmoth, a student in Trinity College, Dublin, quitted it to attend a dying uncle on whom his hopes for independence chiefly rested. John was the orphan son of a younger brother, whose small property scarce could pay John's college expenses, but the uncle was rich, unmarried, and old, and John, from his infancy, had been brought up to look on him with that mingled sensation of awe, and of the wish, without the means to conciliate, that sensation at once attractive and repulsive, with which we regard a being who, as nurse, domestic, and parent have tutored us to believe, holds the very threads of our existence in his hands, and may prolong or snap them when he pleases. On receiving this summons, John set immediately out to attend his uncle. The beauty of the country through which he traveled, it was the county Wicklow, could not prevent his mind from dwelling on many painful thoughts, some borrowed from the past, and more from the future. His uncle's caprice and moroseness, the strange reports concerning the cause of the secluded life he had led for many years, his own dependent state, fell like blows fast and heavy on his mind. He roused himself to repel them, sat up in the mail, in which he was a solitary passenger, looked out on the prospect, consulted his watch, then he thought they receded for a moment, but there was nothing to fill their place, and he was forced to invite them back for company. When the mind is thus active in calling over invaders, no wonder the conquest is soon completed. As the carriage drew near the lodge, the name of old Melmoth's seat, John's heart grew heavier every moment. The recollection of this awful uncle from infancy, when he was never permitted to approach him without innumerable lectures, not to be troublesome, not to go too near his uncle, not to ask him any questions, on no account to disturb the inviolable arrangement of his snuff-box, handbell, and spectacles, nor to suffer the glittering of the gold-headed cane to tempt him to the mortal sin of handling it, and, finally, to pilot himself aright through his perilous course in and out of the apartment, without striking against the piles of books, globes, old newspapers, wig blocks, tobacco pipes, and snuff canisters, not to mention certain hidden rocks of rat traps and moldy books beneath the chairs, together with the final reverential bow at the door, which was to be closed with cautious gentleness, and the stairs to be descended as if he were shod with felt. This recollection was carried on to his schoolboy years, when at Christmas and Easter, the ragged pony, the jest of the school, was dispatched to bring the reluctant visitor to the lodge, where his pastime was to sit vis-a-vis to his uncle, without speaking or moving, till the pair resembled Don Raymond and the ghost of Beatrice in the monk, then watching him as he picked the bones of lean mutton out of his mess of weak broth, the latter of which he handed to his nephew with a needless caution, not to take more than he liked, then hurried to bed by daylight, even in winter, to save the expense of an inch of candle, where he lay awake and restless from hunger, till his uncle's retiring at 8 o'clock gave signal to the gouvernante of the meager household to steal up to him with some fragments of her own scanty meal, administering between every mouthful a whispered caution not to tell his uncle. Then his college life, passed in an attic in the second square, uncheered by an invitation to the country, the gloomy summer wasted in walking up and down the deserted streets, as his uncle would not defray the expenses of his journey, the only intimation of his existence, received in quarterly epistles, containing, with the scanty but punctual remittance, complaints of the expenses of his education, cautions against extravagance, and lamentations for the failure of tenants and the fall of the value of lands. All these recollections came over him, and along with them the remembrance of that last scene, where his dependence on his uncle was impressed on him by the dying lips of his father. "John, I must leave you, my poor boy. It has pleased God to take your father from you before he could do for you what would have made this hour less painful to him. You must look up, John, to your uncle for everything. He has oddities and infirmities, but you must learn to bear with them, and with many other things too, as you will learn too soon. And now, my poor boy, may he who is the father of the fatherless look on your desolate state, and give you favor in the eyes of your uncle." As this scene rose to John's memory, his eyes filled fast with tears, which he hastened to wipe away as the carriage stopped to let him out at his uncle's gate. He alighted, and with a change of linen and a handkerchief, his only traveling equipment, he approached his uncle's gate. The lodge was in ruins, and a barefooted boy from an adjacent cabin ran to lift on its single hinge what had once been a gate, but was now a few planks so villainously put together that they clattered like a sign in a high wind. The stubborn post of the gate, yielding at last to the united strength of John and his barefooted assistant, grated heavily through the mud and gravel stones, in which it left a deep and sluey furrow, and the entrance lay open. John, after searching his pocket in vain for a trifle to reward his assistant, pursued his way, while the lad, on his return, cleared the road at a hop, step, and jump, plunging through the mud with all the dabbling and amphibious delight of a duck, and scarce less proud of his agility than of his surveying a gentleman. As John slowly trod the miry road which had once been the approach, he could discover, by the dim light of an autumnal evening, signs of increasing desolation since he had last visited the spot, signs that penury had been aggravated and sharpened into downright misery. There was not a fence or a hedge round the domain, an uncemented wall of loose stones, whose numerous gaps were filled with furze or thorns, supplied their place. There was not a tree or shrub on the lawn itself was turned into pasture ground, and a few sheep were picking their scanty food amid the pebble stones, thistles, and hard mold, through which a few blades of grass made their rare and squalid appearance. The house itself stood strongly defined even amid the darkness of the evening sky, for there were neither wings, or offices, or shrubbery, or tree, to shade or support it, and soften its strong harsh outline. John, after a melancholy gaze at the grass-grown steps and boarded windows, addressed himself to knock at the door, but knocker there was none. Loose stones, however, there were in plenty, and John was making vigorous application to the door with one of them, till the furious barking of a mastiff, who threatened at every bound to break his chain, and whose yell and growl, accompanied by eyes that glow and fangs that grin, savored as much of hunger as of rage, made the assailant raise the siege on the door, and betake himself to a well-known passage that led to the kitchen. A light glimmered in the window as he approached. He raised the latch with a doubtful hand, but, when he saw the party within, he advanced with the step of a man no longer doubtful of his welcome. Round a turf fire, whose well-replenished fuel gave testimony to the master's indisposition, who would probably as soon have been placed on the fire himself as seen the whole kish emptied on at once, were seated the old housekeeper, 2 or 3 followers, i.e. people who ate, drank, and lounged about in any kitchen that was open in the neighborhood, on an occasion of grief or joy, all for his honor's sake, and for the great respect they bore the family, and an old woman, whom John immediately recognized as the doctress of the neighborhood, a withered sibyl, who prolonged her squalid existence by practicing on the fears, the ignorance, and the sufferings of beings as miserable as herself. Among the better sort, to whom she sometimes had access by the influence of servants, she tried the effects of some simples, her skill in which was sometimes productive of success. Among the lower orders she talked much of the effects of the evil eye, against which she boasted a counterspell of unfailing efficacy, and while she spoke, she shook her grizzled locks with such witch-like eagerness that she never failed to communicate to her half-terrified, half-believing audience some portion of that enthusiasm which, amid all her consciousness of imposture, she herself probably felt a large share of. Still, when the case at last became desperate, when credulity itself lost all patience, and hope and life were departing together, she urged the miserable patient to confess there was something about his heart, and when this confession was extorted from the weariness of pain and the ignorance of poverty, she nodded and muttered so mysteriously as to convey to the bystanders that she had had difficulties to contend with which were invincible by human power. When there was no pretext, from indisposition, for her visiting either his honor's kitchen or the cotter's hut, when the stubborn and persevering convalescence of the whole country threatened her with starvation, she still had a resource. If there were no lives to be shortened, there were fortunes to be told. She worked by spells, and by such daubry as is beyond our element. No one twined so well as she the mystic yarn to be dropped into the Limekill pit, on the edge of which stood the shivering inquirer into futurity, doubtful whether the answer to her question of who holds was to be uttered by the voice of demon or lover. No one knew so well as she to find where the 4 streams met, in which, on the same portentous season, the chemise was to be immersed, and then displayed before the fire, in the name of one whom we dare not mention to ears polite, to be turned by the figure of the destined husband before morning. No one but herself, she said, knew the hand in which the comb was to be held, while the other was employed in conveying the apple to the mouth, while, during the joint operation, the shadow of the phantom spouse was to pass across the mirror before which it was performed. No one was more skillful or active in removing every iron implement from the kitchen where these ceremonies were usually performed by the credulous and terrified dupes of her wizardry, lest, instead of the form of a comely youth exhibiting a ring on his white finger, an headless figure should stalk to the rack, anglaisy, dresser, take down a long spit, or, in default of that, snatch a poker from the fireside, and mercilessly take measure with its iron length of the sleeper for a coffin. No one, in short, knew better how to torment or terrify her victims into a belief of that power which may and has reduced the strongest minds to the level of the weakest, and under the influence of which the cultivated skeptic, Lord Littleton, yelled and gnashed and writhed in his last hours, like the poor girl who, in the belief of the horrible visitation of the vampire, shrieked aloud that her grandfather was sucking her vital blood while she slept, and expired under the influence of imaginary horror. Such was the being to whom old Melmoth had committed his life, half from credulity, and, Hibernize speaking, more than half from avarice. Among this group John advanced, recognizing some, disliking more, distrusting all. The old housekeeper received him with cordiality. He was always her white-head boy, she said. Imprimis, his hair was as black as jet, and she tried to lift her withered hand to his head with an action between a benediction and a caress, till the difficulty of the attempt forced on her the conviction that that head was 14 inches higher than her reach since she had last patted it. The men, with the national deference of the Irish to a person of superior rank, all rose at his approach, their stools chattering on the broken flags, and wished his honor 1,000 years and long life to the back of that, and would not his honor take something to keep the grief out of his heart, and so saying, 5 or 6 red and bony hands tendered him glasses of whiskey all at once. All this time the Sibyl sat silent in the ample chimney corner, sending redoubled whiffs out of her pipe. John gently declined the offer of spirits, received the attentions of the old housekeeper cordially, looked askance at the withered crone who occupied the chimney corner, and then glanced at the table, which displayed other cheer than he had been accustomed to see in his honor's time. There was a wooden dish of potatoes, which old Melmoth would have considered enough for a week's subsistence. There was the salted salmon, a luxury unknown even in London. V. Miss Edgeworth's tails, the absentee. There was the slink veal, flanked with tripe, and, finally, there were lobsters and fried turbot enough to justify what the author of the tale asserts, sua periculo, that when his great-grandfather, the Dean of Killala, hired servants at the deanery, they stipulated that they should not be required to eat turbot or lobster more than twice a week. There were also bottles of Wicklow ale, long and surreptitiously borrowed from his honor's cellar, and which now made their first appearance on the kitchen hearth, and manifested their impatience of further constraint, by hissing, spitting, and bouncing in the face of the fire that provoked its animosity. But the whiskey, genuine illegitimate poteen, smelling strongly of wheat and smoke, and breathing defiance to excisemen, appeared, the veritable amphitryon of the feast. Everyone praised, and drank as deeply as he praised. John, as he looked round the circle, and thought of his dying uncle, was forcibly reminded of the scene at Don Quixote's departure, where, in spite of the grief caused by the dissolution of the worthy knight, we are informed that nevertheless the niece eat her victuals, the housekeeper drank to the repose of his soul, and even Sancho cherished his little carcass. After returning, as he might, the courtesies of the party, John asked how his uncle was. "As bad as he can be, much better, and many thanks to your honor," was uttered in such rapid and discordant unison by the party, that John turned from one to the other, not knowing which or what to believe. "They say his honor has had a fright," said a fellow, upwards of 6 feet high, approaching by way of whispering, and then bellowing the sound 6 inches above John's head. "But then his honor has had a cool since," said a man who was quietly swallowing the spirits that John had refused. At these words the Sibyl who sat in the chimney corner slowly drew her pipe from her mouth, and turned towards the party. The oracular movements of a pythoness on her tripod never excited more awe, or impressed for the moment a deeper silence. "It's not here," said she, pressing her withered finger on her wrinkled forehead, "nor here, nor here," and she extended her hand to the foreheads of those who were near her, who all bowed as if they were receiving a benediction, but had immediate recourse to the spirits afterwards, as if to ensure its effects. "It's all here, it's all about the heart," and as she spoke she spread and pressed her fingers on her hollow bosom with a force of action that thrilled her hearers. "It's all here," she added, repeating the action, probably excited by the effect she had produced, and then sunk on her seat, resumed her pipe, and spoke no more. At this moment of involuntary awe on the part of John, and of terrified silence on that of the rest, an unusual sound was heard in the house, and the whole company started as if a musket had been discharged among them. It was the unwonted sound of old Melmoth's bell. His domestics were so few, and so constantly near him, that the sound of his bell startled them as much as if he had been ringing the knell for his own interment. "He used always to rap down for me," said the old housekeeper, hurrying out of the kitchen. "He said pulling the bells wore out the ropes." The sound of the bell produced its full effect. The housekeeper rushed into the room, followed by a number of women, the Irish prefecti, all ready to prescribe for the dying or weep for the dead, all clapping their hard hands, or wiping their dry eyes. These hags all surrounded the bed, and to witness their loud, wild, and desperate grief, their cries of "Oh! He's going, his honor's going, his honor's going," one would have imagined their lives were bound up in his, like those of the wives in the story of Sinbad the Sailor, who were to be interred alive with their deceased husbands. 4 of them wrung their hands and howled round the bed, while one, with all the adroitness of a Mrs. Quickly, felt his honor's feet, and upward, and all was cold as any stone. Old Melmoth withdrew his feet from the grasp of the hag, counted with his keen eye, keen amid the approaching dimness of death, the number assembled round his bed, raised himself on his sharp elbow, and pushing away the housekeeper, who attempted to settle his nightcap, that had been shoved on one side in the struggle, and gave his haggard, dying face a kind of grotesque fierceness, bellowed out in tones that made the company start, "What the devil brought ye all here?" The question scattered the whole party for a moment, but rallying instantly, they communed among themselves in whispers, and frequently using the sign of the cross, muttered, "The devil, Christ save us, the devil in his mouth the first word he spoke." "Aye," roared the invalid, "and the devil in my eye the first sight I see." Where, cried the terrified housekeeper, clinging close to the invalid in her terror, and half hiding herself in the blanket, which she snatched without mercy from his struggling and exposed limbs. "There, he repeated, during the battle of the blanket, pointing to the huddled and terrified women, who stood aghast at hearing themselves anointed as the very demons they came to banish. "Oh! Lord keep your honor's head," said the housekeeper in a more soothing tone, when her fright was over, "and sure your honor knows them all, is in her name, and her name, and her name," and she pointed respectively to each of them, adding their names, which we shall spare the English reader the torture of reciting, as a proof of our lenity, adding the last only, Cochlin O'Mulligan. "Ye lie, ye bh," growled old Melmoth, "their name is Legion, for they are many, turn them all out of the room, turn them all out of doors. If they howl at my death, they shall howl in earnest, not for my death, for they would see me dead and damned too with dry eyes, but for want of the whiskey that they would have stolen if they could have got at it." And here old Melmoth grasped a key which lay under his pillow, and shook it in vain triumph at the old housekeeper, who had long possessed the means of getting at the spirits unknown to his honor, and for want of the victuals you have pampered them with. "Pampered, OCHST, ejaculated the housekeeper. "Aye, and what are there so many candles for, all 4s, and the same below I warrant." "Ah! You, worthless, wasteful old devil." "Indeed, your honor, they are all 6s. "6s, and what the devil are you burning 6s for? D'ye think it's the wake already?" "Ha! Oh! Not yet, your honor, not yet," chorused the beldams, "but in God's good time, your honor knows," in a tone that spoke ill-suppressed impatience for the event. "Oh! That your honor would think of making your soul." "That's the first sensible word you have said," said the dying man. "Fetch me the prayer book, you'll find it there under that old bootjack. Blow off the cobwebs, it has not been opened this many a year." It was handed to him by the old gouvernante, on whom he turned a reproaching eye. "What made you burn 6s in the kitchen, you extravagant jade? How many years have you lived in this house?" "I don't know, your honor." "Did you ever see any extravagance or waste in it?" "Oh, never, your honor." "Was anything but a farthing candle ever burned in the kitchen?" "Never, your honor." "Were not you kept as tight as hand and head and heart could keep you, were you not? Answer me that." "Oh yes, sure, your honor, every soul about us knows that. Everyone does your honor justice, that you kept the closest house and closest hand in the country, your honor was always a good warrant for it. And how dare you unlock my hold before death has unlocked it, said the dying miser, shaking his meager hand at her. I smelt meat in the house, I heard voices in the house, I heard the key turn in the door over and over. Oh, that I was up, he added, rolling in impatient agony in his bed, oh, that I was up, to see the waste and ruin that is going on. But it would kill me, he continued, sinking back on the bolster, for he never allowed himself a pillow, it would kill me, the very thought of it is killing me now. The women, discomfited and defeated, after sundry winks and whispers, were huddling out of the room, till recalled by the sharp eager tones of old Melmoth. Where are ye trooping to now? Back to the kitchen to gourmandize and guzzle? Won't one of ye stay and listen while there's a prayer read for me? Ye may want it one day for yourselves, ye hags. Awed by this expostulation and menace, the train silently returned, and placed themselves round the bed, while the housekeeper, though a Catholic, asked if his honor would not have a clergyman to give him the rites of his church. The eyes of the dying man sparkled with vexation at the proposal. What for, just to have him expect a scarf and hatband at the funeral? Read the prayers yourself, you old, that will save something. The housekeeper made the attempt, but soon declined it, alleging, as her reason, that her eyes had been watery ever since his honor took ill. That's because you had always a drop in them, said the invalid, with a spiteful sneer, which the contraction of approaching death stiffened into a hideous grin. Here, is not there one of you that's gnashing and howling there, that can get up a prayer to keep me from it? So adjured, one of the women offered her services, and of her it might truly be said, as of the most disartless man of the watch in Dogberry's time, that her reading and writing came by nature, for she never had been at school, and had never before seen or opened a Protestant prayer book in her life. Nevertheless, on she went, and with more emphasis than good discretion, read nearly through the service for the churching of women, which in our prayer books following that of the burial of the dead, she perhaps imagined was some way connected with the state of the invalid. She read with great solemnity. It was a pity that 2 interruptions occurred during the performance, one from old Melmoth, who, shortly after the commencement of the prayers, turned towards the old housekeeper, and said, in a tone scandalously audible, "Go down and draw the niggers of the kitchen fire closer, and lock the door, and let me hear it locked. I can't mind anything till that's done." The other was from John Melmoth, gliding into the room, hearing the inappropriate words uttered by the ignorant woman, taking quietly as he knelt beside her the prayer book from her hands, and reading in a suppressed voice part of that solemn service which, by the forms of the Church of England, is intended for the consolation of the departing. "That is John's voice," said the dying man, and the little kindness he had ever showed this unfortunate lad rushed on his hard heart at this moment, and touched it. He saw himself, too, surrounded by heartless and rapacious menials, and slight as must have been his dependence on a relative whom he had always treated as a stranger, he felt at this hour he was no stranger, and grasped at his support like a straw amid his wreck. "John, my good boy, you are there. I kept you far from me when living, and now you are nearest me when dying. John, read on." John, affected deeply by the situation in which he beheld this poor man, amid all his wealth, as well as by the solemn request to impart consolation to his dying moments, read on, but in a short time his voice became indistinct, from the horror with which he listened to the increasing hiccup of the patient, which, however, he struggled with from time to ask the housekeeper if the niggers were closed. John, who was a lad of feeling, rose from his knees in some degree of agitation. "What, are you leaving me like the rest?" said old Melmoth, trying to raise himself in the bed. "No, sir," said John, "but, observing the altered looks of the dying man, I think you want some refreshment, some support, sir." I do, but whom can I trust to get it for me? They, and as haggard I wandered round the group, they would poison me." "Trust me, sir," said John, "I will go to the apothecaries, or whoever you may employ." The old man grasped his hand, drew him close to his bed, cast a threatening yet fearful eye round the party, and then whispered in a voice of agonized constraint, "I want a glass of wine, it would keep me alive for some hours, but there is not one I can trust to get it for me, they'd steal a bottle, and ruin me." John was greatly shocked. "Sir, for God's sake, let me get a glass of wine for you." "Do you know where?" said the old man, with an expression in his face John could not understand. "No, sir, you know I have been rather a stranger here, sir." "Take this key," said old Melmoth, after a violent spasm, "take this key, there is wine in that closet, Madeira." I always told them there was nothing there, but they did not believe me, or I should not have been robbed as I have been. At one time I said it was whiskey, and then I fared worse than ever, for they drank twice as much of it. John took the key from his uncle's hand, the dying man pressed it as he did so, and John, interpreting this as a mark of kindness, returned the pressure. He was undeceived by the whisper that followed, "John, my lad, don't drink any of that wine while you are there." "Good God," said John, indignantly throwing the key on the bed, then, recollecting that the miserable being before him was no object of resentment, he gave the promise required, and entered the closet, which no foot but that of old Melmoth had entered for nearly 60 years. He had some difficulty in finding out the wine, and indeed stayed long enough to justify his uncle's suspicions, but his mind was agitated, and his hand unsteady. He could not but remark his uncle's extraordinary look, that had the ghastliness of fear superadded to that of death, as he gave him permission to enter his closet. He could not but see the looks of horror which the women exchanged as he approached it. And, finally, when he was in it, his memory was malicious enough to suggest some faint traces of a story, too horrible for imagination, connected with it. He remembered in one moment most distinctly that no one but his uncle had ever been known to enter it for many years. Before he quitted it, he held up the dim light, and looked around him with a mixture of terror and curiosity. There was a great deal of decayed and useless lumber, such as might be supposed to be heaped up to rot in a miser's closet, but John's eyes were in a moment, and as if by magic, riveted on a portrait that hung on the wall, and appeared, even to his untaught eye, far superior to the tribe of family pictures that are left to moulder on the walls of a family mansion. It represented a man of middle age. There was nothing remarkable in the costume, or in the countenance, but the eyes, John felt, were such as one feels they wish they had never seen, and feels they can never forget. Had he been acquainted with the poetry of Southey, he might have often exclaimed in his after life, "Only the eyes had life. They gleamed with demon light." Thalaba. From an impulse equally resistless and painful, he approached the portrait, held the candle towards it, and could distinguish the words on the border of the painting, J.N.O. Melmoth, Anno 1646. John was neither timid by nature, or nervous by constitution, or superstitious from habit, yet he continued to gaze in stupid horror on this singular picture, till, aroused by his uncle's cough, he hurried into his room. The old man swallowed the wine. He appeared a little revived. It was long since he had tasted such a cordial. His heart appeared to expand to a momentary confidence. "John, what did you see in that room?" "Nothing, sir." "That's a lie. Everyone wants to cheat or to rob me." "Sir, I don't want to do either." "Well, what did you see that you took notice of?" "Only a picture, sir." "A picture, sir. The original is still alive." John, though under the impression of his recent feelings, could not but look incredulous. "John," whispered his uncle, "John, they say I am dying of this and that, and one says it is for want of nourishment, and one says it is for want of medicine, but, John," and his face looked hideously ghastly, "I am dying of a fright. That man," and he extended his meager arm toward the closet, as if he was pointing to a living being, "that man, I have good reason to know, is alive still." "How is that possible, sir?" said John involuntarily. "The date on the picture is 1646. "You have seen it, you have noticed it," said his uncle. "Well," he rocked and nodded on his bolster for a moment, then, grasping John's hand with an unutterable look, he exclaimed, "You will see him again, he is alive." Then, sinking back on his bolster, he fell into a kind of sleep or stupor, his eyes still open, and fixed on John. The house was now perfectly silent, and John had time and space for reflection. More thoughts came crowding on him than he wished to welcome, but they would not be repulsed. He thought of his uncle's habits and character, turned the matter over and over again in his mind, and he said to himself, "The last man on earth to be superstitious." He never thought of anything but the price of stocks, and the rate of exchange, and my college expenses, that hung heavier at his heart than all, and such a man to die of a fright, a ridiculous fright, that a man living 150 years ago is alive still, and yet, he is dying. John paused, for facts will confute the most stubborn logician. With all his hardness of mind, and of heart, he is dying of a fright. I heard it in the kitchen, I have heard it from himself, he could not be deceived. If I had ever heard he was nervous, or fanciful, or superstitious, but a character so contrary to all these impressions, a man that, as poor Butler says, in his Remains of the Antiquarian, would have sold Christ over again for the numerical piece of silver which Judas got for him, such a man to die of fear. Yet he is dying, said John, glancing his fearful eye on the contracted nostril, the glazed eye, the dropping jaw, the whole horrible apparatus of the facies Hippocratica displayed, and soon to cease its display. Old Melmoth at this moment seemed to be in a deep stupor, his eyes lost that little expression they had before, and his hands, that had convulsively been catching at the blankets, let go their short and quivering grasp, and lay extended on the bed like the claws of some bird that had died of hunger, so meagre, so yellow, so spread. John, unaccustomed to the sight of death, believed this to be only a sign that he was going to sleep, and, urged by an impulse for which he did not attempt to account to himself, caught up the miserable light, and once more ventured into the forbidden room, the blue chamber of the dwelling. The motion roused the dying man, he sat bolt upright in his bed. This John could not see, for he was now in the closet, but he heard the groan, or rather the choked and guggling rattle of the throat, that announces the horrible conflict between muscular and mental convulsion. He started, turned away, but, as he turned away, he thought he saw the eyes of the portrait, on which his own was fixed, move, and hurried back to his uncle's bedside. Old Melmoth died in the course of that night, and died as he had lived, in a kind of avaricious delirium. John could not have imagined a scene so horrible as his last hours presented. He cursed and blasphemed about 3 halfpence, missing, as he said, some weeks before, in an account of change with his groom, about hay to a starved horse that he kept. Then he grasped John's hand, and asked him to give him the sacrament. If I send to the clergyman, he will charge me something for it, which I cannot pay, I cannot. They say I am rich, look at this blanket, but I would not mind that, if I could save my soul. And, raving, he added, indeed, doctor, I am a very poor man. I never troubled a clergyman before, and all I want is, that you will grant me 2 trifling requests, very little matters in your way, save my soul, and, whispering, make interest to get me a parish coffin, I have not enough left to bury me. I always told everyone I was poor, but the more I told them so, the less they believed me. John, greatly shocked, retired from the bedside, and sat down in a distant corner of the room. The women were again in the room, which was very dark. Melmoth was silent from exhaustion, and there was a death-like pause for some time. At this moment John saw the door open, and a figure appear at it, who looked round the room, and then quietly and deliberately retired, but not before John had discovered in his face the living original of the portrait. His first impulse was to utter an exclamation of terror, but his breath felt stopped. He was then rising to pursue the figure, but a moment's reflection checked him. What could be more absurd than to be alarmed or amazed at a resemblance between a living man and the portrait of a dead one? The likeness was doubtless strong enough to strike him even in that darkened room, but it was doubtless only a likeness, and though it might be imposing enough to terrify an old man of gloomy and retired habits, and with a broken constitution, John resolved it should not produce the same effect on him. But while he was applauding himself for this resolution, the door opened, and the figure appeared at it, beckoning and nodding to him, with a familiarity somewhat terrifying. John now started up, determined to pursue it, but the pursuit was stopped by the weak but shrill cries of his uncle, who was struggling at once with the agonies of death, and his housekeeper. The poor woman, anxious for her master's reputation and her own, was trying to put on him a clean shirt and nightcap, and Melmoth, who had just sensation enough to perceive they were taking something from him, continued exclaiming feebly, "They are robbing me in my last moments, robbing a dying man. John, won't you assist me? I shall die a beggar. They are taking my last shirt. I shall die a beggar." And the miser died. 2. You that wonder, scream, and groan. round the mansions once your own. Row. A few days after the funeral, the will was opened before proper witnesses, and John was found to be left sole heir to his uncle's property, which, though originally moderate, had, by his grasping habits and parsimonious life, become very considerable. As the attorney who read the will concluded, he added, "There are some words here, at the corner of the parchment, which do not appear to be part of the will, as they are neither in the form of a codicil, nor is the signature of the testator affixed to them, but, to the best of my belief, they are in the handwriting of the deceased." As he spoke he showed the lines to Melmoth, who immediately recognized his uncle's hand, that perpendicular and penurious hand, that seems determined to make the most of the very paper, thriftily abridging every word, and leaving scarce an atom of margin, and read, not without some emotion, the following words: "I enjoin my nephew and heir, John Melmoth, to remove, destroy, or cause to be destroyed, the portrait inscribed J. Melmoth, 1646, hanging in my closet. I also enjoin him to search for a manuscript, which I think he will find in the third and lowest left-hand drawer of the mahogany chest standing under that portrait. It is among some papers of no value, such as manuscript sermons, and pamphlets on the improvement of Ireland, and such stuff. He will distinguish it by its being tied round with a black tape, and the paper being very mouldy and discolored. He may read it if he will. I think he had better not. At all events, I adjure him, if there be any power in the adjuration of a dying man, to burn it." After reading this singular memorandum, the business of the meeting was again resumed, and as old Melmoth's will was very clear and legally worded, all was soon settled, the party dispersed, and John Melmoth was left alone. We should have mentioned, that his guardians appointed by the will, for he was not yet of age, advised him to return to college, and complete his education as soon as proper, but John urged the expediency of paying the respect due to his uncle's memory, by remaining a decent time in the house after his decease. This was not his real motive. Curiosity, or something that perhaps deserves a better name, the wild and awful pursuit of an indefinite object, had taken strong hold of his mind. His guardians, who were men of respectability and property in the neighborhood, and in whose eyes John's consequence had risen rapidly since the reading of the will, pressed him to accept of a temporary residence in their respective houses till his return to Dublin. This was declined gratefully, but steadily. They called for their horses, shook hands with the heir, and rode off. Melmoth was left alone. The remainder of the day was passed in gloomy and anxious deliberation, in traversing his late uncle's room, approaching the door of the closet, and then retreating from it, in watching the clouds, and listening to the wind, as if the gloom of the one, or the murmurs of the other, relieved instead of increasing the weight that pressed on his mind. Finally, towards evening, he summoned the old woman, from whom he expected something like an explanation of the extraordinary circumstances he had witnessed since his arrival at his uncle's. The old woman, proud of the summons, readily attended, but she had very little to tell. Her communication was nearly in the following words: we spare the reader her endless circumlocutions, her Irishisms, and the frequent interruptions arising from her applications to her snuff-box, and to the glass of whiskey punch with which Melmoth took care to have her supplied. The old woman deposed, that his honor, as she always called the deceased, was always intent upon the little room inside his bedchamber, and reading there, within the last 2 years, that people, knowing his honor had money, and thinking it must be there, had broke into that room. In other words, there was a robbery attempted there, but finding nothing but some papers, they had retired. That he was so frightened, he had bricked up the window, but she thought there was more in it than that. For when his honor missed but a halfpenny, he would make the house ring about it, but that, when the closet was bricked up, he never said a word. That afterwards his honor used to lock himself up in his own room, and though he was never fond of reading, was always found, when his dinner was brought him, hanging over a paper, which he hid the moment anyone came into the room. And once there was a great bustle about a picture that he tried to conceal, that knowing there was an odd story in the family, she did her best to come at it, and even went to Biddy Brannigan's, the medical sibyl before mentioned, to find out the rights of it, but Biddy only shook her head, filled her pipe, uttered some words she did not understand, and smoked on. That it was but 2 evenings before his honor was struck, i.e. took ill. She was standing at the door of the court, which had once been surrounded by stables, pigeon-house, and all the usual etceteras of a gentleman's residence, but now presented only a ruinous range of dismantled out offices, thatched with thistles, and tenanted by pigs. When His Honor called to her to lock the door, His Honor was always keen about locking the doors early. She was hastening to do so, when he snatched the key from her, swearing at her, for he was always very keen about locking the doors, though the locks were so bad, and the keys so rusty, that it was always like the cry of the dead in the house when the keys returned, that she stood aside for a minute, seeing he was angry, and gave him the key. When she heard him utter a scream, and saw him fall across the doorway, that she hurried to raise him, hoping it was a fit, that she found him stiff and stretched out, and called for help to lift him up, that then people came from the kitchen to assist, that she was so bewildered and terrified, she hardly knew what was done or said, but with all her terror remembered, that as they raised him up, the first sign of life he gave was lifting up his arm, and pointing it towards the court, and at that moment she saw the figure of a tall man cross the court, and go out of the court. She knew not where or how, for the outer gate was locked, and had not been opened for years, and they were all gathered round His Honor at the other door. She saw the figure, she saw the shadow on the wall, she saw him walk slowly through the court, and in her terror cried, "Stop him!" But nobody minded her, all being busy about her master. And when he was brought to his room, nobody thought but of getting him to himself again. And further she could not tell. His Honor, young Melmoth, knew as much as she. He had witnessed his last moments, had heard his last words. She saw him die. How could she know more than His Honor? "True," said Melmoth. "I certainly saw him die. But you say there was an odd story in the family. Do you know anything about it?" "Not a word. It was long before my time, as old as I am." "Certainly it must have been so. But was my uncle ever superstitious, fanciful?" And Melmoth was compelled to use many synonymous expressions before he could make himself understood. When he did, the answer was plain, undecisive: "No, never, never." When His Honor sat in the kitchen and wished to save a fire in his own room, he could never bear the talk of the old man that came into life with pipes and times, from time to time. He used to show such impatience of their superstitious nonsense, that they were fain to smoke it in silence, without the consolatory accompaniment of one whisper about a child that the evil eye had looked on, or another, that though apparently it was peevish, crippled bread all day, would regularly out at night to dance with people on the top of a neighboring mountain, summoned their tune by the sound of a bagpipe, which was unfailingly heard at the cabin door every night. Melmoth's thoughts began to take somewhat of a darker turn. Yet his uncle was not superstitious, might he not have been guilty, and might not have strange and sudden death, and even the terrible visitation that preceded it, have been owing to some wrong that his rapacity had done the widow and the fatherless. He questioned the old woman indirectly and cautiously on the subject. Her answer completely justified the decease. "He was a man," she said, "of a hard man, and a hard heart, but he was as jealous of another's right as himself. He would have starved all the world, but he would not have robbed him of farthing." Melmoth's last resource was to send her to Brendan, who was still in the house, and from whom he at least hoped to hear the odd story that the old woman confessed was in the family. She came, and, on her introduction to Melmoth, it was curious to observe the mingled look of servility and command, the result of the habits of her life, which was alternately one of abject mendicity, and of arrogant but clever imposture. When she first appeared, she stood at the door, awed and curtsying in the presence, and muttering sounds which, possibly intended for blessing of her own hat, from the hearty tone in which she looked at the speaker, every appearance of malediction. But when interrogated on the subject of the story, she rose at once into consequence. Her figure seemed frightfully dilated, like that of Virgil's Alecto, who exchanges in a moment the appearance of a feeble old woman for that of a menacing fury. She walked deliberately across the room, seated, or rather squatted herself on the hearthstone like a hare in her form, spread her bony and withered hands towards the blaze, and rocked for a considerable time in silence before she commenced her tale. When she had finished it, Melmoth remained in astonishment at the state of mind to which the late singular circumstances had reduced him, at finding himself listening with varying and increasing emotions of interest, curiosity, and terror, to a tale so wild, so improbable, nay, so actually incredible, that he at least blushed for the folly he could not conquer. The result of these impressions was a resolution to visit the closet, and examine the manuscript that very night. This resolution he found it impossible to execute immediately, for, on inquiring for lights, the governante confessed the very last had been burnt at his honor's wake, and a barefooted boy was charged to run for life and death to the neighboring village for candles, and if you could borrow a couple of candlesticks, added the housekeeper. "Are there no candlesticks in the house?" said Melmoth. "There are, honey, plenty, but it's no time to be opening the old chest, for the plated ones, in regard of their being at the bottom of it, and the brass ones that's in the house, one of them has no socket, and the other has no bottom." "And how did you make shift yourself?" said Melmoth. "I stuck it in a potato," quoth the housekeeper. So the gossoon ran for life and death, and Melmoth, towards the close of the evening, was left alone to meditate. It was an evening apt for meditation, and Melmoth had his fill of it before the messenger returned. The weather was cold and gloomy, heavy clouds betokened a long and dreary continuance of autumnal rains, cloud after cloud came sweeping on like the dark banners of an approaching host, whose march is for desolation. As Melmoth leaned against the window, whose dismantled frame, and pieced and shattered panes, shook with every gust of wind, his eye encountered nothing but that most cheerless of all prospects, a miser's garden, walls broken down, grass-grown walks whose grass was not even green, dwarfish, dotted, leafless trees, and a luxuriant crop of nettles and weeds rearing their unlovely heads where there had once been flowers, all waving and bending in capricious and unsightly forms, as the wind sighed over them. It was the verdure of the churchyard, the garden of death. He turned for relief to the room, but no relief was there, the wainscoting dark with dirt, and in many places cracked and starting from the walls, the rusty grate, so long unconscious of a fire, that nothing but a sullen smoke could be coaxed to issue from between its dingy bars, the crazy chairs, their torn bottoms of rush drooping inwards, and the great leathern seat displaying the stuffing round the worn edges, while the nails, though they kept their places, had failed to keep the covering. They once fastened, the chimney-piece, which, tarnished more by time than by smoke, displayed for its garniture half a pair of snuffers, a tattered almanac of 1750, a timekeeper dumb for want of repair, and a rusty fowling-piece without a lock. No wonder the spectacle of desolation drove Melmoth back to his own thoughts, restless and uncomfortable as they were. He recapitulated the Sibyl's story word by word, with the air of a man who is cross-examining an evidence, and trying to make him contradict himself. The first of the Melmoths, she says, who settled in Ireland, was an officer in Cromwell's army, who obtained a grant of lands, the confiscated property of an Irish family attached to the royal cause. The elder brother of this man was one who had travelled abroad, and resided so long on the continent, that his family had lost all recollection of him. Their memory was not stimulated by their affection, for there were strange reports concerning the traveller. He was said to be, like the damned magician, Great Glendower, a gentleman profited in strange concealments. It must be remembered, that at this period, and even to a later, the belief in astrology and witchcraft was very general. Even so late as the reign of Charles II, Dryden calculated the nativity of his son Charles, the ridiculous books of Glanville were in general circulation, and Del Rio and Wyrus were so popular, that even a dramatic writer, Shadwell, quoted copiously from them, in the notes subjoined to his curious comedy of the Lancashire Witches. It was said, that during the lifetime of Melmoth, the traveller paid him a visit, and though he must have then been considerably advanced in life, to the astonishment of his family, he did not betray the slightest trace of being a year older than when they last beheld him. His visit was short, he said nothing of the past or the future, nor did his family question him. It was said that they did not feel themselves perfectly at ease in his presence. On his departure he left them his picture, the same which Melmoth saw in the closet, bearing date 1646, and they saw him no more. Some years after, a person arrived from England, directed to Melmoth's house, in pursuit of the traveller, and exhibiting the most marvellous and unappeasable solicitude to obtain some intelligence of him. The family could give him none, and after some days of restless inquiry and agitation, he departed, leaving behind him, either through negligence or intention, a manuscript, containing an extraordinary account of the circumstances under which he had met John Melmoth the traveller, as he was called. The manuscript and portrait were both preserved, and of the original a report spread that he was still alive, and had been frequently seen in Ireland even to the present century, but that he was never known to appear but on the approaching death of one of the family, nor even then, unless when the evil passions or habits of the individual had cast a shade of gloomy and fearful interest over their dying hour. It was therefore judged no favorable augury for the spiritual destination of the last Melmoth that this extraordinary person had visited, or been imagined to visit, the house previous to his decease. Such was the account given by Biddy Brannigan, to which she added her own solemnly attested belief that John Melmoth the traveller was still without a hair on his head changed, or a muscle in his frame contracted, that she had seen those that had seen him, and would confirm their evidence by oath if necessary, that he was never heard to speak, seen to partake of food, or known to enter any dwelling but that of his family, and, finally, that she herself believed that his late appearance boded no good either to the living or the dead. John was still musing on these things when the lights were procured, and, disregarding the pallid countenances and monitory whispers of the attendants, he resolutely entered the closet, shut the door, and proceeded to search for the manuscript. It was soon found, for the directions of old Melmoth were forcibly written, and strongly remembered. The manuscript, old, tattered, and discolored, was taken from the very drawer in which it was mentioned to be laid. Melmoth's hands felt as cold as those of his dead uncle when he drew the blotted pages from their nook. He sat down to read. There was a dead silence through the house. Melmoth looked wistfully at the candles, snuffed them, and still thought they looked dim. Perchance he thought they burned blue, but such thought he kept to himself. Certain it is, he often changed his posture, and would have changed his chair, had there been more than one in the apartment. He sunk for a few moments into a fit of gloomy abstraction, till the sound of the clock striking 12 made him start. It was the only sound he had heard for some hours, and the sounds produced by inanimate things, while all living beings around are as dead, have at such an hour an effect indescribably awful. John looked at his manuscript with some reluctance, opened it, paused over the first lines, and as the wind sighed round the desolate apartment, and the rain pattered with a mournful sound against the dismantled window, wished. What did he wish for? He wished the sound of the wind less dismal, and the dash of the rain less monotonous. He may be forgiven. It was past midnight, and there was not a human being awake but himself within 10 miles when he began to read. 3. Aperbat Eidolon Senex. Pliny. The manuscript was discolored, obliterated, and mutilated beyond any that had ever before exercised the patience of a reader. Michaelis himself, scrutinizing into the pretended autograph of St. Mark at Venice, never had a harder time of it. Melmoth could make out only a sentence here and there. The writer, it appeared, was an Englishman of the name of Stanton, who had travelled abroad shortly after the Restoration. Travelling was not then attended with the facilities which modern improvement has introduced, and scholars and literati, the intelligent, the idle, and the curious, wandered over the continent for years, like Tom Coriat, though they had the modesty, on their return, to entitle the result of their multiplied observations and labors only crudities. Stanton, about the year 1676, was in Spain. He was, like most of the travelers of that age, a man of literature, intelligence, and curiosity, but ignorant of the language of the country, and fighting his way at times from convent to convent, in quest of what was called hospitality, that is, obtaining board and lodging on the condition of holding a debate in Latin, on some point theological or metaphysical, with any monk who would become the champion of the strife. Now, as the theology was Catholic, and the metaphysics Aristotelian, Stanton sometimes wished himself at the miserable posada from whose filth and famine he had been fighting his escape, but though his reverend antagonists always denounced his creed, and comforted themselves, even in defeat, with the assurance that he must be damned, on the double score of his being a heretic and an Englishman, they were obliged to confess that his Latin was good, and his logic unanswerable, and he was allowed, in most cases, to sup and sleep in peace. This was not doomed to be his fate on the night of the August 17th, 1677, when he found himself in the plains of Valencia, deserted by a cowardly guide, who had been terrified by the sight of a cross erected as a memorial of a murder, had slipped off his mule unperceived, crossing himself every step he took on his retreat from the heretic, and left Stanton amid the terrors of an approaching storm, and the dangers of an unknown country. The sublime and yet softened beauty of the scenery around had filled the soul of Stanton with delight, and he enjoyed that delight as Englishmen generally do, silently. The magnificent remains of 2 dynasties that had passed away, the ruins of Roman palaces, and of Moorish fortresses, were around and above him. The dark and heavy thunderclouds that advanced slowly seemed like the shrouds of these specters of departed greatness. They approached, but did not yet overwhelm or conceal them, as if nature herself was for once awed by the power of man. And far below, the lovely valley of Valencia blushed and burned in all the glory of sunset, like a bride receiving the last glowing kiss of the bridegroom before the approach of night. Stanton gazed around. The difference between the architecture of the Roman and Moorish ruins struck him. Among the former are the remains of a theater, and something like a public place, the latter present only the remains of fortresses, embattled, castellated, and fortified from top to bottom, not a loophole for pleasure to get in by. The loopholes were only for arrows. All denoted military power and despotic subjugation à l'outrance. The contrast might have pleased a philosopher, and he might have indulged in the reflection that though the ancient Greeks and Romans were savages, as Dr. Johnson says all people who want to press must be, and he says truly, yet they were wonderful savages for their time, for they alone have left traces of their taste for pleasure in the countries they conquered, in their superb theaters, temples, which were also dedicated to pleasure one way or another, and baths, while other conquering bands of savages never left anything behind them but traces of their rage for power. So thought Stanton, as he still saw strongly defined, though darkened by the darkening clouds, the huge skeleton of a Roman amphitheater, its arched and gigantic colonnades now admitting a gleam of light, and now commingling with the purple thundercloud, and now the solid and heavy mass of a Moorish fortress, no light playing between its impermeable walls, the image of power, dark, isolated, impenetrable. Stanton forgot his cowardly guide, his loneliness, his danger amid an approaching storm and an inhospitable country, where his name and country would shut every door against him, and every peal of thunder would be supposed justified by the daring intrusion of a heretic in the dwelling of an old Christian, as the Spanish Catholics absurdly term themselves, to mark the distinction between them and the baptized Moors. All this was forgot in contemplating the glorious and awful scenery before him, light struggling with darkness, and darkness menacing a light still more terrible, and announcing its menace in the blue and livid mass of cloud that hovered like a destroying angel in the air, its arrows aimed, but their direction awfully indefinite. But he ceased to forget these local and petty dangers, as the sublimity of romance would term them, when he saw the first flash of the lightning, broad and red as the banners of an insulting army whose motto is Vi Victis, shatter to atoms the remains of a Roman tower. The rift stones rolled down the hill, and fell at the feet of Stanton. He stood appalled, and, awaiting his summons from the power in whose pyramids, palaces, and the worms whose toil has formed them, and the worms who toil out their existence under their shadow or their pressure, are perhaps all alike contemptible, he stood collected, and for a moment felt that defiance of danger which danger itself excites, and we love to encounter it as a physical enemy, to bid it do its worst, and feel that its worst will perhaps be ultimately its best for us. He stood and saw another flash dart its bright, brief, and malignant glance over the ruins of ancient power, and the luxuriance of recent fertility. Singular contrast. The relics of art forever decaying, the productions of nature forever renewed. Alas! For what purpose are they renewed, better than to mock at the perishable monuments which men try in vain to rival them by? The pyramids themselves must perish, but the grass that grows between their disjointed stones will be renewed from year to year. Stanton was thinking thus, when all power of thought was suspended, by seeing 2 persons bearing between them the body of a young, and apparently very lovely girl, who had been struck dead by the lightning. Stanton approached, and heard the voices of the bearers repeating, "There is none who will mourn for her." "There is none who will mourn for her," said other voices, as 2 more bore in their arms the blasted and blackened figure of what had once been a man, comely and graceful. "There is not one to mourn for her now." They were lovers, and he had been consumed by the flash that had destroyed her, while in the act of endeavoring to defend her. As they were about to remove the bodies, a person approached with a calmness of step and demeanor, as if he were alone unconscious of danger, and incapable of fear, and after looking on them for some time, burst into a laugh so loud, wild, and protracted, that the peasants, starting with as much horror at the sound as at that of the storm, hurried away, bearing the corpse with them. Even Stanton's fears were subdued by his astonishment, and, turning to the stranger, who remained standing on the same spot, he asked the reason of such an outrage on humanity. The stranger, slowly turning round, and disclosing a countenance which, here the manuscript was illegible for a few lines, said in English. A long hiatus followed here, and the next passage that was legible, though it proved to be a continuation of the narrative, was but a fragment. The terrors of the night rendered Stanton a sturdy and unappeasable applicant, and the shrill voice of the old woman, repeating, "No heretic, no English, Mother of God protect us, avaunt Satan," combined with the clatter of the wooden casement, peculiar to the houses in Valencia, which she opened to discharge her volley of anathematization, and shut again as the lightning glanced through the aperture, were unable to repel his importunate request for admittance, in a night whose terrors ought to soften all the miserable petty local passions into one awful feeling of fear for the power who caused it, and compassion for those who were exposed to it. But Stanton felt there was something more than national bigotry in the exclamations of the old woman. There was a peculiar and personal horror of the English. And he was right, but this did not diminish the eagerness of his. The house was handsome and spacious, but the melancholy appearance of desertion. The benches were by the wall, but there were none to sit there. The tables were spread in what had been the hall, but it seemed as if none had gathered round them for many years. The clock struck audibly. There was no voice of mirth or of occupation to drown its sound. Time told his awful lesson to silence alone. The hearths were black with fuel long since consumed. The family portraits looked as if they were the only tenants of the mansion. They seemed to say, from their mouldering frames, "There are none to gaze on us," and the echo of the steps of Stanton and his feeble guide was the only sound audible between the peals of thunder that rolled still awfully, but more distantly, every peal like the exhausted murmurs of a spent heart. As they passed on, a shriek was heard. Stanton paused, and fearful images of the dangers to which travelers on the continent are exposed in deserted and remote habitations came into his mind. "Don't heed it," said the old woman, lighting him on with a miserable lamp, "it is only he." The old woman having now satisfied herself, by ocular demonstration, that her English guest, even if he was the devil, had neither horn, hoof, or tail, that he could bear the sign of the cross without changing his form, and that, when he spoke, not a puff of sulphur came out of his mouth, began to take courage, and at length commenced her story, which, weary and comfortless as Stanton was, every obstacle was now removed. Parents and relations at last gave up all opposition, and the young pair were united. Never was there a lovelier. They seemed like angels who had only anticipated by a few years their celestial and eternal union. The marriage was solemnized with much pomp, and a few days after there was a feast in that very wainscot chamber which you paused to remark was so gloomy. It was that night hung with rich tapestry, representing the exploits of the Cid, particularly that of his burning a few Moors who refused to renounce their accursed religion. They were represented beautifully tortured, writhing and howling, and Muhammad, issuing out of their mouths, as they called on him in their burning agonies. You could almost hear them scream. At the upper end of the room, under a splendid estrade, over which was an image of the Blessed Virgin, sat Dona Isabella de Cardoza, mother to the bride, and near her Dona Inés, the bride, on rich almohadas. The bridegroom sat opposite to her, and though they never spoke to each other, their eyes, slowly raised, but suddenly withdrawn, those eyes that blushed, told to each other the delicious secret of their happiness. Don Pedro de Cardoza had assembled a large party in honor of his daughter's nuptials. Among them was an Englishman of the name of Melmoth, a traveler. No one knew who had brought him there. He sat silent like the rest, while the iced waters and the sugared wafers were presented to the company. The night was intensely hot, and the moon glowed like a sun over the ruins of Saguntum. The embroidered blinds flapped heavily, as if the wind made an effort to raise them in vain, and then desisted. Another defect in the manuscript occurred here, but it was soon supplied. The company were dispersed through various alleys of the garden. The bridegroom and bride wandered through one where the delicious perfume of the orange trees mingled itself with that of the myrtles and blow. On their return to the hall, both of them asked, had the company heard the exquisite sounds that floated through the garden just before they quitted it? No one had heard them. They expressed their surprise. The Englishman had never quitted the hall. It was said he smiled with a most particular and extraordinary expression as the remark was made. His silence had been noticed before, but it was ascribed to his ignorance of the Spanish language, an ignorance that Spaniards are not anxious either to expose or remove by speaking to a stranger. The subject of the music was not again reverted to till the guests were seated at supper, when Dona Inés and her young husband, exchanging a smile of delighted surprise, exclaimed they heard the same delicious sounds floating round them. The guests listened, but no one else could hear it. Everyone felt there was something extraordinary in this. "Hush!" was uttered by every voice almost at the same moment. A dead silence followed. You would think, from their intent looks, that they listened with their very eyes. This deep silence, contrasted with the splendor of the feast, and the light effused from torches held by the domestics, produced a singular effect. It seemed for some moments like an assembly of the dead. The silence was interrupted, though the cause of wonder had not ceased, by the entrance of Father Olavida, the confessor of Dona Isabella, who had been called away previous to the feast, to administer extreme unction to a dying man in the neighborhood. He was a priest of uncommon sanctity, beloved in the family, and respected in the neighborhood, where he had displayed uncommon taste and talents for exorcism. In fact, this was the good father's forte, and he piqued himself on it accordingly. The devil never fell into worse hands than Father Olavida's, for when he was so contumacious as to resist Latin, and even the first verses of the Gospel of St. John in Greek, which the good father never had recourse to but in cases of extreme stubbornness and difficulty. Here Stanton recollected the English story of the boy of Bilson, and blushed even in Spain for his countrymen. Then he always applied to the Inquisition, and if the devils were ever so obstinate before, they were always seen to fly out of the possessed, just as, in the midst of their cries, no doubt of blasphemy, they were tied to the stake. Some held out even till the flames surrounded them, but even the most stubborn must have been dislodged when the operation was over, for the devil himself could no longer tenant a crisp and glutinous lump of cinders. Thus Father Olavida's fame spread far and wide, and the Cardoza family had made uncommon interest to procure him for a confessor, and happily succeeded. The ceremony he had just been performing had cast a shade over the good father's countenance, but it dispersed as he mingled among the guests, and was introduced to them. Room was soon made for him, and he happened accidentally to be seated opposite the Englishman. As the wine was presented to him, Father Olavida, who, as I observed, was a man of singular sanctity, prepared to utter a short internal prayer. He hesitated, trembled, desisted, and, putting down the wine, wiped the drops from his forehead with the sleeve of his habit. Dona Isabella gave a sign to a domestic, and other wine of a higher quality was offered to him. His lips moved, as if in the effort to pronounce a benediction on it and the company, but the effort again failed, and the change in his countenance was so extraordinary that it was perceived by all the guests. He felt the sensation that his extraordinary appearance excited, and attempted to remove it by again endeavoring to lift the cup to his lips. So strong was the anxiety with which the company watched him, that the only sound heard in that spacious and crowded hall was the rustling of his habit, as he attempted to lift the cup to his lips once more, in vain. The guests sat in astonished silence. Father Olavida alone remained standing, but at that moment the Englishman rose, and appeared determined to fix Olavida's regards by a gaze like that of fascination. Olavida rocked, reeled, grasped the arm of a page, and at last, closing his eyes for a moment, as if to escape the horrible fascination of that unearthly glare, the Englishman's eyes were observed by all the guests, from the moment of his entrance, to effuse a most fearful and preternatural luster, exclaimed, "Who is among us? Who? I cannot utter a blessing while he is here. I cannot feel one. Where he treads, the earth is parched. Where he breathes, the air is fire. Where he feeds, the food is poison. Where he turns, his glance is lightning. Who is among us?" "Who?" repeated the priest in the agony of adjuration, while his cowl fallen back, his few thin hairs around the scalp instinct and alive with terrible emotion, his outspread arms protruded from the sleeves of his habit, and extended towards the awful stranger, suggested the idea of an inspired being in the dreadful rapture of prophetic denunciation. He stood, still stood, and the Englishman stood calmly opposite to him. There was an agitated irregularity in the attitudes of those around them, which contrasted strongly the fixed and stern postures of those two, who remained gazing silently at each other. "Who knows him?" exclaimed Olavida, starting apparently from a trance. Who knows him? Who brought him here? The guests severally disclaimed all knowledge of the Englishman, and each asked the other in whispers who had brought him there. Father Olavida then pointed his arm to each of the company, and asked each individually, "Do you know him?" "No! No! No!" was uttered with vehement emphasis by every individual. "But I know him," said Olavida, "by these cold drops," and he wiped them off, "by these convulsed joints," and he attempted to sign the cross, but could not. He raised his voice, and evidently speaking with increased difficulty, "by this bread and wine, which the faithful receive as the body and blood of Christ, but which his presence converts into matter as viperous as the suicide foam of the dying Judas, by all these, I know him, and command him to be gone. He is, and he bent forwards as he spoke, and gazed on the Englishman with an expression which the mixture of rage, hatred, and fear rendered terrible. All the guests rose at these words. The whole company now presented two singular groups, that of the amazed guests all collected together, and repeating, "Who, what is he?" and that of the Englishman, who stood unmoved, and Olavida, who dropped dead in the attitude of pointing to him. The body was removed into another room, and the departure of the Englishman was not noticed till the company returned to the hall. They sat late together, conversing on this extraordinary circumstance, and finally agreed to remain in the house, lest the evil spirit, for they believed the Englishman no better, should take certain liberties with the course by no means agreeable to a Catholic, particularly as he had manifestly died without the benefit of the last sacraments. Just as this laudable resolution was formed, they were roused by cries of horror and agony from the bridal chamber, where the young pair had retired. They hurried to the door, but the father was first. They burst it open, and found the bride a corpse in the arms of her husband. He never recovered his reason. The family deserted the mansion rendered terrible by so many misfortunes. One apartment is still tenanted by the unhappy maniac. His were the cries you heard as you traversed the deserted rooms. He is for the most part silent during the day, but at midnight he always exclaims, in a voice frightfully piercing, and hardly human, "They are coming! They are coming!" and relapses into profound silence. The funeral of Father Olavida was attended by an extraordinary circumstance. He was interred in a neighboring convent, and the reputation of his sanctity, joined to the interest caused by his extraordinary death, collected vast numbers at the ceremony. His funeral sermon was preached by a monk of distinguished eloquence, appointed for the purpose. To render the effect of his discourse more powerful, the corpse, extended on a bier, with its face uncovered, was placed in the aisle. The monk took his text from one of the prophets, "Death is gone up into our palaces." He expatiated on mortality, whose approach, whether abrupt or lingering, is alike awful to man. He spoke of the vicissitudes of empires with much eloquence and learning, but his audience were not observed to be much affected. He cited various passages from the lives of the saints, descriptive of the glories of martyrdom, and the heroism of those who had bled and blazed for Christ and his blessed Mother, but they appeared still waiting for something to touch them more deeply. When he inveighed against the tyrants under whose bloody persecutions those holy men suffered, his hearers were roused for a moment, for it is always easier to excite a passion than a moral feeling. But when he spoke of the dead, and pointed with emphatic gesture to the corpse, as it lay before them cold and motionless, every eye was fixed, and every ear became attentive. Even the lovers, who, under pretense of dipping their fingers into the holy water, were contriving to exchange amorous billets, forbore for one moment this interesting intercourse, to listen to the preacher. He dwelt with much energy on the virtues of the deceased, whom he declared to be a particular favorite of the Virgin, and enumerating the various losses that would be caused by his departure to the community to which he belonged, to society, and to religion at large, he at last worked up himself to a vehement expostulation with the deity on the occasion. "Why hast thou," he exclaimed, "why hast thou, O God, thus dealt with us? Why hast thou snatched from our sight this glorious saint, whose merits, if properly applied, doubtless would have been sufficient to atone for the apostasy of St. Peter, the opposition of St. Paul, previous to his conversion, and even the treachery of Judas himself? Why hast thou, O God, snatched him from us?" And a deep and hollow voice from among the congregation answered, "Because he deserved his fate. The murmurs of approbation with which the congregation honored this apostrophe half drowned this extraordinary interruption, and though there was some little commotion in the immediate vicinity of the speaker, the rest of the audience continued to listen intently. "What," proceeded the preacher, pointing to the corse, "what hath laid thee there, servant of God?" "Pride, ignorance, and fear," answered the same voice, in accents still more thrilling. The disturbance now became universal. The preacher paused, and a circle opening, disclosed the figure of a monk belonging to the convent, who stood among them. After all the usual modes of admonition, exhortation, and discipline had been employed, and the bishop of the diocese, who, under the report of these extraordinary circumstances, had visited the convent in person to obtain some explanation from the contumacious monk in vain, it was agreed, in a chapter extraordinary, to surrender him to the power of the Inquisition. He testified great horror when this determination was made known to him, and offered to tell over and over again all that he could relate of the cause of Father Olavida's death. His humiliation, and repeated offers of confession, came too late. He was conveyed to the Inquisition. The proceedings of that tribunal are rarely disclosed, but there is a secret report, I cannot answer for its truth, of what he said and suffered there. On his first examination, he said he would relate all he could. He was told that was not enough, he must relate all he knew. "Why did you testify such horror at the funeral of Father Olavida?" Everyone testified horror and grief at the death of that venerable ecclesiastic, who died in the odor of sanctity. Had I done otherwise, it might have been reckoned a proof of my guilt. Why did you interrupt the preacher with such extraordinary exclamations? To this no answer. Why do you refuse to explain the meaning of those exclamations? No answer. Why do you persist in this obstinate and dangerous silence? Look, I beseech you, brother, at the cross that is suspended against this wall, and the inquisitor pointed to the large black crucifix at the back of the chair where he sat. One drop of the blood shed there can purify you from all the sin you have ever committed, but all that blood, combined with the intercession of the Queen of Heaven, and the merits of all its martyrs, nay, even the absolution of the Pope, cannot deliver you from the curse of dying in unrepented sin. What sin, then, have I committed? The greatest of all possible sins. You refuse answering the questions put to you at the tribunal of the most holy and merciful Inquisition. You will not tell us what you know concerning the death of Father Olavida. I have told you that I believe he perished in consequence of his ignorance and presumption. What proof can you produce of that? He sought the knowledge of a secret withheld from man. What was that? The secret of discovering the presence or agency of the evil power. Do you possess that secret? After much agitation on the part of the prisoner, he said distinctly, but very faintly, "My master forbids me to disclose it." If your master were Jesus Christ, he would not forbid you to obey the commands, or answer the questions of the Inquisition. I am not sure of that. There was a general outcry of horror at these words. The examination then went on. If you believed Olavida to be guilty of any pursuits or studies condemned by our Mother the Church, why did you not denounce him to the Inquisition? Because I believed him not likely to be injured by such pursuits. His mind was too weak, he died in the struggle, said the prisoner with great emphasis. You believe, then, it requires strength of mind to keep those abominable secrets, when examined as to their nature and tendency? No, I rather imagine strength of body. We shall try that presently, said an inquisitor, giving a signal for the torture. The prisoner underwent the first and second applications with unshrinking courage, but on the infliction of the water torture, which is indeed insupportable to humanity, either to suffer or relate, he exclaimed in the gasping interval, he would disclose everything. He was released, refreshed, restored, and the following day uttered the following remarkable confession. The old Spanish woman further confessed to Stanton, that the Englishman certainly had been seen in the neighborhood since, seen, as she had heard, that very night. Great G.D., exclaimed Stanton, as he recollected the stranger whose demoniac laugh had so appalled him, while gazing on the lifeless bodies of the lovers, whom the lightning had struck and blasted. As the manuscript, after a few blotted and illegible pages, became more distinct, Melmoth read on, perplexed and unsatisfied, not knowing what connection this Spanish story could have with his ancestor, whom, however, he recognized under the title of the Englishman, and wondering how Stanton could have thought it worth his while to follow him to Ireland, write a long manuscript about an event that occurred in Spain, and leave it in the hands of his family to verify untrue things, in the language of Dogberry, his wonder was diminished, though his curiosity was still more inflamed, by the perusal of the next lines, which he made out with some difficulty. It seemed Stanton was now in England. About the year 1677, Stanton was in London, his mind still full of his mysterious countryman. This constant subject of his contemplations had produced a visible change in his exterior. His walk was what Sallust tells us of Catalan's, his were, too, the fidi oculi. He said to himself every moment, "If I could but trace that being, I will not call him man," and the next moment he said, "And what if I could?" In this state of mind, it is singular enough that he mixed constantly in public amusements, but it is true. When one fierce passion is devouring the soul, we feel more than ever the necessity of external excitement, and our dependence on the world for temporary relief increases in direct proportion to our contempt of the world and all its works. He went frequently to the theatres, then fashionable, when the fair sat panting at a courtier's play, and not a mask went unimproved away. The London theatres then presented a spectacle which ought forever to put to silence the foolish outcry against progressive deterioration of morals, foolish even from the pen of Juvenal, and still more so from the lips of a modern Puritan. Vice is always nearly on an average. The only difference in life worth tracing is that of manners, and there we have manifestly the advantage of our ancestors. Hypocrisy is said to be the homage that vice pays to virtue. Decorum is the outward expression of that homage, and if this be so, we must acknowledge that vice has latterly grown very humble indeed. There was, however, something splendid, ostentatious, and obtrusive in the vices of Charles II's reign. A view of the theatres alone proved it, when Stanton was in the habit of visiting them. At the doors stood on one side the footmen of a fashionable nobleman, with arms concealed under their liveries, surrounding the sedan of a popular actress, one whom they were to carry off 6 et armis, as she entered it at the end of the play. At the other side waited the glass coach of a woman of fashion, who waited to take Canaston, the Adonis of the day, in his female dress, to the park after the play was over, and exhibit him in all the luxurious splendor of effeminate beauty, heightened by theatrical dress, for which he was so distinguished. Plays being then performed at 4 o'clock, allowed ample time for the evening drive, and the midnight assignation, when the parties met by torchlight, masked, in St. James's Park, and verified the title of Wycherley's play, Love in a Wood. The boxes, as Stanton looked round him, were filled with females, whose naked shoulders and bosoms, well testified in the paintings of Lely and the pages of Grammont, might save modern Puritanism many a vituperative groan and affected reminiscence. They had all taken the precaution to send some male relative, on the first night of a new play, to report whether it was fit for persons of honor and reputation to appear at, but in spite of this precaution, at certain passages, which occurred about every second sentence, they were compelled to spread out their fans, or play with the still-cherished Lovelock, which Prynne himself had not been able to write down. The men in the boxes were composed of 2 distinct classes, the men of wit and pleasure about town, distinguished by their Flanders lace cravats, soiled with snuff, their diamond rings, the pretended gift of a royal mistress, and import whether the Duchess of Portsmouth or Nell Gwynn, their uncombed wigs, whose curls descended to their waists, and the loud and careless tone in which they abused Dryden, Lee, and Otway, and quoted Sedley and Rochester. The other class were the lovers, the gentle squires of dames, equally conspicuous for their white French gloves, their obsequious bows, and their commencing every sentence addressed to a lady, with the profane exclamation of "O Jesu," or the softer, but equally unmeaning one of "I beseech you, madam," or "Madam, I burn." One circumstance sufficiently extraordinary marked the manners of the day. Females had not then found their proper level in life. They were alternately adored as goddesses, and assailed as prostitutes, and the man who, this moment, addressed his mistress in language borrowed from Orondate's worshipping Cassandra, in the next accosted her with ribaldry that might put to the blush the piazzas of Covent Garden. The pit presented a more various spectacle. There were the critics armed capapi from Aristotle and Bossu. These men dined at 12, dictated at a coffee-house till 4, then called to the boy to brush their shoes, and strode to the theatre, where, till the curtain rose, they sat hushed in grim repose, and expecting their evening prey. There were the Templars, spruce, pert, and loquacious, and here and there a sober citizen, doffing his steeple-crowned hat, and hiding his little band under the folds of his huge puritanic cloak, while his eyes, declined with an expression half leering, half ejaculatory, towards a masked female, muffled in a hood and scarf, testified what had seduced him into these tents of Kedar. There were females, too, but all in visored masks, which, though worn as well as Aunt Dinah's in Tristram Shandy, served to conceal them from the young bubbles they were in quest of, and from all but the orange women, who hailed them loudly as they passed the doors. In the galleries were the happy souls who waited for the fulfillment of Dryden's promise in one of his prologues, no matter to them whether it were the ghost of Almanzor's mother in her dripping shroud, or that of Laius, who, according to the stage directions, rises in his chariot, armed with the ghosts of his 3 murdered attendants behind him, a joke that did not escape l'Abbé Leblanc, in his recipe for writing an English tragedy. Some, indeed, from time to time called out for the burning of the Pope, but though space was obedient to the boundless peace which opened in Mexico and closed in Greece, it was not always possible to indulge them in this laudable amusement, as the scene of the popular plays was generally laid in Africa or Spain, Sir Robert Howard, Elkanah Settle, and John Dryden, all agreeing in their choice of Spanish and Moorish subjects for their principal plays. Among this joyous group were seated several women of fashion masked, enjoying in secrecy the licentiousness which they dared not openly patronize, and verifying Gay's characteristic description, though it was written many years later. Mobbed in the gallery Laura sits secure, and laughs at jests that turn the box demure. Stanton gazed on all this with the look of one who could not be moved to smile at anything. He turned to the stage. The play was Alexander, then acted as written by Lee, and the principal character was performed by Hart, whose godlike ardor in making love is said almost to have compelled the audience to believe that they beheld the son of Ammon. There were absurdities enough to offend a classical, or even a rational spectator. There were Grecian heroes with roses in their shoes, feathers in their hats, and wigs down to their waists, and Persian princesses in stiff stays and powdered hair. But the illusion of the scene was well sustained, for the heroines were rivals in real as well as theatrical life. It was that memorable night, when, according to the history of the veteran Betterton, Mrs. Barry, who personated Roxana, had a greenroom squabble with Mrs. Bowtell, the representative of Statira, about a veil, which the partiality of the property man adjudged to the latter. Roxana suppressed her rage till the 5th act, when, stabbing Statira, she aimed the blow with such force as to pierce through her stays, and inflict a severe though not dangerous wound. Mrs. Bowtell fainted, the performance was suspended, and, in the commotion which this incident caused in the house, many of the audience rose, and Stanton among them. It was at this moment that, in a seat opposite to him, he discovered the object of his search for 4 years, the Englishman whom he had met in the plains of Valencia, and whom he believed the same with the subject of the extraordinary narrative he had heard there. He was standing up. There was nothing particular or remarkable in his appearance, but the expression of his eyes could never be mistaken or forgotten. The heart of Stanton palpitated with violence, a mist overspread his eyes, a nameless and deadly sickness, accompanied with a creeping sensation in every pore, from which cold drops were gushing, announced the. Before he had well recovered, a strain of music, soft, solemn, and delicious, breathed round him, audibly ascending from the ground, and increasing in sweetness and power till it seemed to fill the whole building. Under the sudden impulse of amazement and pleasure, he inquired of some around him from whence those exquisite sounds arose. But, by the manner in which he was answered, it was plain that those he addressed considered him insane, and, indeed, the remarkable change in his expression might well justify the suspicion. He then remembered that night in Spain, when the same sweet and mysterious sounds were heard only by the young bridegroom and bride, of whom the latter perished on that very night. And am I then to be the next victim, thought Stanton, and are those celestial sounds, that seem to prepare us for heaven, only intended to announce the presence of an incarnate fiend, who mocks the devoted with airs from heaven, while he prepares to surround them with blasts from hell? It is very singular that at this moment, when his imagination had reached its highest pitch of elevation, when the object he had pursued so long and fruitlessly had in one moment become as it were tangible to the grasp both of mind and body, when this spirit, with whom he had wrestled in darkness, was at last about to declare its name, that Stanton began to feel a kind of disappointment at the futility of his pursuits, like Bruce at discovering the source of the Nile, or Gibbon on concluding his history. The feeling which he had dwelt on so long, that he had actually converted it into a duty, was after all mere curiosity, but what passion is more insatiable, or more capable of giving a kind of romantic grandeur to all its wanderings and eccentricities? Curiosity is in one respect like love, it always compromises between the object and the feeling, and provided the latter possesses sufficient energy, no matter how contemptible the former may be. A child might have smiled at the agitation of Stanton, caused as it was by the accidental appearance of a stranger, but no man, in the full energy of his passions, was there, but must have trembled at the horrible agony of emotion with which he felt approaching, with sudden and irresistible velocity, the crisis of his destiny. When the play was over, he stood for some moments in the deserted streets. It was a beautiful moonlight night, and he saw near him a figure, whose shadow projected half across the street. There were no flagged ways then, chains and posts were the only defense of the foot-passenger, appeared to him of gigantic magnitude. He had been so long accustomed to contend with these phantoms of the imagination, that he took a kind of stubborn delight in subduing them. He walked up to the object, and observing the shadow only was magnified, and the figure was the ordinary height of man, he approached it, and discovered the very object of his search, the man whom he had seen for a moment in Valencia, and, after a search of 4 years, recognized at the theater. "You were in quest of me?" "I was." "Have you anything to inquire of me?" "Much." "Speak, then." "This is no place." "No place!" "Poor wretch, I am independent of time and place." "Speak, if you have anything to ask or to learn." "I have many things to ask, but nothing to learn, I hope, from you." "You deceive yourself, but you will be undeceived when next we meet." "And when shall that be?" said Stanton, grasping his arm. "Name your hour and your place." "The hour shall be midday," answered the stranger, with a horrid and unintelligible smile, "and the place shall be the bare walls of a madhouse, where you shall rise rattling in your chains, and rustling from your straw, to greet me, yet still you shall have the curse of sanity, and of memory. My voice shall ring in your ears till then, and the glance of these eyes shall be reflected from every object, animate or inanimate, till you behold them again." "Is it under circumstances so horrible we are to meet again?" said Stanton, shrinking under the full-lighted blaze of those demon eyes. "I never," said the stranger, in an emphatic tone, "I never desert my friends in misfortune. When they are plunged in the lowest abyss of human calamity, they are sure to be visited by me." The narrative, when Melmoth was again able to trace its continuation, described Stanton, some years after, plunged in a state the most deplorable. He had been always reckoned of a singular turn of mind, and the belief of this, aggravated by his constant talk of Melmoth, his wild pursuit of him, his strange behavior at the theatre, and his dwelling on the various particulars of their extraordinary meetings, with all the intensity of the deepest conviction, while he never could impress them on any one's conviction but his own, suggested to some prudent people the idea that he was deranged. Their malignity probably took part with their prudence. The selfish Frenchman says, "We feel a pleasure even in the misfortunes of our friends, a plus forte in those of our enemies," and as everyone is an enemy to a man of genius, of course, the report of Stanton's malady was propagated with infernal and successful industry. Stanton's next relative, a needy, unprincipled man, watched the report in its circulation, and saw the snares closing round his victim. He waited on him one morning, accompanied by a person of a grave, though somewhat repulsive appearance. Stanton was as usual abstracted and restless, and, after a few moments' conversation, he proposed a drive a few miles out of London, which he said would revive and refresh him. Stanton objected, on account of the difficulty of getting a hackney coach, for it is singular that at this period the number of private equipages, though infinitely fewer than they are now, exceeded the number of hired ones, and proposed going by water. This, however, did not suit the kinsman's views, and, after pretending to send for a carriage, which was in waiting at the end of the street, Stanton and his companions entered it, and drove about 2 miles out of London. The carriage then stopped. "Come, cousin," said the younger Stanton, "come and view a purchase I have made." Stanton absently alighted, and followed him across a small paved court. The other person followed. "In troth, cousin," said Stanton, "your choice appears not to have been discreetly made. Your house has something of a gloomy aspect." "Hold you content, cousin," replied the other, "I shall take order that you like it better, when you have been some time a dweller therein." Some attendants of a mean appearance, and with most suspicious visages, awaited them on their entrance, and they ascended a narrow staircase, which led to a room meanly furnished. "Wait here," said the kinsman, to the man who accompanied them, "till I go for company to divertise my cousin in his loneliness." They were left alone. Stanton took no notice of his companion, but as usual seized the first book near him, and began to read. It was a volume in manuscript. They were then much more common than now. The first line struck him as indicating insanity in the writer. It was a wild proposal, written apparently after the Great Fire of London, to rebuild it with stone, and attempting to prove, on a calculation wild, false, and yet sometimes plausible, that this could be done out of the colossal fragments of Stonehenge, which the writer proposed to remove for that purpose. Subjoined were several grotesque drawings of engines designed to remove those massive blocks, and in a corner of the page was a note: "I would have drawn these more accurately, but was not allowed a knife to mend my pen." The next was entitled, "A modest proposal for the spreading of Christianity in foreign parts, whereby it is hoped its entertainment will become general all over the world." This modest proposal was, to convert the Turkish ambassadors, who had been in London a few years before, by offering them their choice of being strangled on the spot, or becoming Christians. Of course the writer reckoned on their embracing the easier alternative, but even this was to be clogged with a heavy condition, namely, that they must be bound before a magistrate to convert 20 Mussulmans a day, on their return to Turkey. The rest of the pamphlet was reasoned very much in the conclusive style of Captain Bobadil. These 20 will convert 20 more apiece, and these 200 converts, converting their due number in the same time, all Turkey would be converted before the Grand Signior knew where he was. Then comes the coup d'éclat. One fine morning, every minaret in Constantinople was to ring out with bells, instead of the cry of the muezzins, and the imam, coming out to see what was the matter, was to be encountered by the Archbishop of Canterbury, in pontificalibus, performing cathedral service in the church of St. Sophia, which was to finish the business. Here an objection appeared to arise, which the ingenuity of the writer had anticipated. "It may be read argued," saith he, "by those who have more spleen than brain, that forasmuch as the Archbishop preacheth in English, he will not thereby much edify the Turkish folk, who do altogether hold in a vain gabble of their own. But this, to use his own language, he evites, by judiciously observing, that where service was performed in an unknown tongue, the devotion of the people was always observed to be much increased thereby, as, for instance, in the Church of Rome, that St. Augustine, with his monks, advanced to meet King Ethelbert singing litanies, in a language his majesty could not possibly have understood, and converted him and his whole court on the spot, that the Sibylline books cum multis aliis." Between the pages were cut most exquisitely in paper the likenesses of some of these Turkish ambassadors. The hair of the beards, in particular, was feathered with a delicacy of touch that seemed the work of fairy fingers, but the pages ended with a complaint of the operator, that his scissors had been taken from him. However, he consoled himself and the reader with the assurance that he would that night catch a moonbeam as it entered through the grating, and, when he had wetted it on the iron knobs of his door, would do wonders with it. In the next page was found a melancholy proof of powerful but prostrated intellect. It contained some insane lines, ascribed to Lee the dramatic poet, commencing, "Oh that my lungs could bleat like buttered peas," etc. There is no proof whatever that these miserable lines were really written by Lee, except that the measure is the fashionable quatrain of the period. It is singular that Stanton read on without suspicion of his own danger, quite absorbed in the album of a madhouse, without ever reflecting on the place where he was, and which such compositions too manifestly designated. It was after a long interval that he looked round, and perceived that his companion was gone. Bells were unusual then. He proceeded to the door. It was fastened. He called aloud. His voice was echoed in a moment by many others, but in tones so wild and discordant that he desisted in involuntary terror. As the day advanced, and no one approached, he tried the window, and then perceived for the first time it was grated. It looked out on the narrow flagged yard, in which no human being was, and if there had, from such a being no human feeling could have been extracted. Sickening with unspeakable horror, he sunk rather than sat down beside the miserable window, and wished for day. At midnight he started from a doze, half a swoon, half asleep, which probably the hardness of his seat, and of the deal table on which he leaned, had not contributed to prolong. He was in complete darkness. The horror of his situation struck him at once, and for a moment he was indeed almost qualified for an inmate of that dreadful mansion. He felt his way to the door, shook it with desperate strength, and uttered the most frightful cries, mixed with expostulations and commands. His cries were in a moment echoed by 100 voices. In maniacs there is a peculiar malignity, accompanied by an extraordinary acuteness of some of the senses, particularly in distinguishing the voice of a stranger. The cries that he heard on every side seemed like a wild and infernal yell of joy that their mansion of misery had obtained another tenant. He paused, exhausted. A quick and thundering step was heard in the passage. The door was opened, and a man of savage appearance stood at the entrance. 2 more were seen indistinctly in the passage. "Release me, villain!" "Stop, my fine fellow, what's all this noise for?" "Where am I?" "Where you ought to be." "Will you dare to detain me?" "Yes, and a little more than that," answered the ruffian, applying a loaded horsewhip to his back and shoulders, till the patient soon fell to the ground convulsed with rage and pain. "Now you see you are where you ought to be," repeated the ruffian, brandishing the horsewhip over him, "and now take the advice of a friend, and make no more noise. The lads are ready for you with the darbies, and they'll clink them on in the crack of this whip, unless you prefer another touch of it first." They then were advancing into the room as he spoke, with fetters in their hands, strait waistcoats being then little known or used, and showed, by their frightful countenances and gestures, no unwillingness to apply them. Their harsh rattle on the stone pavement made Stanton's blood run cold. The effect, however, was useful. He had the presence of mind to acknowledge his supposed miserable condition, to supplicate the forbearance of the ruthless keeper, and promise complete submission to his orders. This pacified the ruffian, and he retired. Stanton collected all his resolution to encounter the horrible night. He saw all that was before him, and summoned himself to meet it. After much agitated deliberation, he conceived it best to continue the same appearance of submission and tranquillity, hoping that thus he might in time either propitiate the wretches in whose hands he was, or, by his apparent inoffensiveness, procure such opportunities of indulgence as might perhaps ultimately facilitate his escape. He therefore determined to conduct himself with the utmost tranquillity, and never to let his voice be heard in the house, and he laid down several other resolutions with a degree of prudence which he already shuddered to think might be the cunning of incipient madness, or the beginning result of the horrid habits of the place. These resolutions were put to desperate trial that very night. Just next to Stanton's apartment were lodged 2 most uncongenial neighbors. One of them was a puritanical weaver, who had been driven mad by a single sermon from the celebrated Hugh Peters, and was sent to the madhouse as full of election and reprobation as he could hold, and fuller. He regularly repeated over the 5 points while daylight lasted, and imagined himself preaching in a conventicle with distinguished success. Towards twilight his visions were more gloomy, and at midnight his blasphemies became horrible. In the opposite cell was lodged a loyalist tailor, who had been ruined by giving credit to the cavaliers and their ladies, for at this time, and much later, down to the reign of Anne, tailors were employed by females even to make in fit on their stays, who had run mad with drink and loyalty on the burning of the rump, and ever since had made the cells of the madhouse echo with fragments of the ill-fated Colonel Lovelace's songs, scraps from Cowley's Cutter of Coleman Street, and some curious specimens from Mrs. Aphra-Behns' plays, where the cavaliers are denominated the heroics, and Lady Lambert and Lady Desborough represented as going to meeting, their large Bibles carried before them by their pages, and falling in love with 2 banished cavaliers by the way. "Tabitha, Tabitha," cried a voice half in exultation and half in derision, "thou shalt go with thy hair curled, and thy breasts naked," and then added in an affected voice, "I could dance the canaries once, spouse." This never failed to rouse the feelings, or rather operate on the instincts of the puritanic weaver, who immediately answered, "Colonel Harrison shall come out of the west, riding on a sky-colored mule, which signifies instruction." "Ye lie, ye round-head son of ABH," roared the Cavalier Tailor, "Colonel Harrison will be damned before he ever mounts a sky-colored mule," and he concluded this pithy sentence with fragments of anti-Oliverian songs. "And may I live to see old Noll upon a tree, and many such as he. Confound him, confound him. Diseases all around him. Ye are honest gentlemen, I can play many tunes," squeaked a poor mad loyalist fiddler, who had been accustomed to play in the taverns to the Cavalier party, and just remembered the words of a similar minstrel playing for Colonel Blunt and the committee. "Then play me the heir to rebellion is breaking up house," exclaimed the tailor, dancing wildly about his cell, as far as his chains allowed him, to an imaginary measure. The weaver could contain no longer. "How long, Lord, how long," he exclaimed, "shall thine enemies insult thy sanctuary, in which I have been placed an anointed teacher? Even here, where I am placed to preach to the souls in prison? Open the floodgates of thy power, and though thy waves and storms go over me, let me testify in the midst of them, even as he who spreadeth forth his hands to swim may raise one of them to warn his companion that he is about to sink. Sister Ruth, why dost thou uncover thy bosom to discover my frailty? Lord, let thine arm of power be with us as it was when thou breakest the shield, the sword, and the battle, when thy foot was dipped in the blood of thine enemies, and the tongue of thy dogs was red through the same. Dip all thy garments in blood, and let me weave thee fresh when thou art stained. When shall thy saints tread the winepress of thy wrath? Blood! Blood! The saints call for it, earth gapes to swallow it, hell thirsts for it. Sister Ruth, I pray thee, conceal thy bosom, and be not as the vain women of this generation. Oh, for a day like that, a day of the Lord of hosts, when the towers fell. Spare me in the battle, for I am not a mighty man of war, leave me in the rear of the host, to curse, with the curse of Meroz, those who come not to the help of the Lord against the mighty, even to curse this malignant tailor, yea, curse him bitterly. Lord, I am in the tents of Kedar, my feet stumble on the dark mountains, I fall, I fall. And the poor wretch, exhausted by his delirious agonies, fell, and grovelled for some time in his straw. Oh! I have had a grievous fall, Sister Ruth, O Sister Ruth. Rejoice not against me, O mine enemy. Though I fall, I shall rise again. Whatever satisfaction Sister Ruth might have derived from this assurance, if she could have heard it, was enjoyed tenfold by the weaver, whose amorous reminiscences were in a moment exchanged for warlike ones, borrowed from a wretched and disarranged mass of intellectual rubbish. The Lord is a man of war, he shouted. Look to Marston Moor. Look to the city, the proud city, full of pride and sin. Look to the ways of the Severn, as red with blood as the waves of the Red Sea. There were the hoofs broken by means of the prancings of the mighty ones. Then, Lord, was thy triumph, and the triumph of thy saints, to bind their kings in chains, and their nobles in links of iron. The malignant tailor burst out in his turn, thanked the false Scots, and their solemn league and covenant, and Carisbrooke Castle, for that, ye croppered Puritan, he yelled. If it had not been for them, I would have taken measure of the king for a velvet cloak as high as the Tower of London, and one flirt of its folds would have knocked the copper nose into the Thames, and sent it adrift to hell. Ye lie, in your teeth, echoed the weaver, and I will prove it unarmed, with my shuttle against your needle, and smite you to the earth thereafter, as David smote Goliath. It was the man's, such was the indecent language in which Charles I was spoken of by the Puritans, it was the man's carnal, self-seeking, world-loving, prelatical hierarchy, that drove the godly to seek the sweet word in season from their own pastors, who righteously abominated the popish garniture of lawn-sleeves, lute organs, and steeple-houses. Sister Ruth, tempt me not with that calf's head, it is all streaming with blood, drop it, I beseech thee, sister, it is unmeet in a woman's hand, though the brethren drink of it. Woe be unto thee, gainsayer, dost thou not see how flames envelop the accursed city under his Arminian and Popish sun? London is on fire! On fire, he yelled, and the brands are lit by the half-papist, whole Arminian, all damned people thereof. Fire! Fire! The voice in which he shrieked out the last words was powerfully horrible, but it was like the moan of an infant, compared to the voice which took up and re-echoed the cry, in a tone that made the building shake. It was the voice of a maniac, who had lost her husband, children, subsistence, and finally her reason, in the dreadful fire of London. The cry of fire never failed to operate with terrible punctuality on her associations. She had been in a disturbed sleep, and now started from it as suddenly as on that dreadful night. It was Saturday night, too, and she was always observed to be particularly violent on that night. It was the terrible weekly festival of insanity with her. She was awake, and busy in a moment escaping from the flames, and she dramatized the whole scene with such hideous fidelity that Stanton's resolution was far more in danger from her than from the battle between his neighbor's testimony and Hothead. She began exclaiming she was suffocated by the smoke, then she sprung from her bed, calling for a light, and appeared to be struck by the sudden glare that burst through her casement. "The last day," she shrieked, "the last day! The very heavens are on fire!" "Thou wilt not come till the man of sin be first destroyed," cried the weaver. "Thou ravest of light and fire, and yet thou art in utter darkness. I pity thee, poor mad soul, I pity thee." The maniac never heeded him. She appeared to be scrambling up a staircase to her children's room. She exclaimed she was scorched, singed, suffocated. Her courage appeared to fail, and she retreated. "But my children are there," she cried in a voice of unspeakable agony, as she seemed to make another effort. Here I am come to save you. Oh God! They are all blazing. Take this arm." "No, not that, it is scorched and disabled." "Well, any arm, take hold of my clothes." "No, they are blazing too." "Well, take me all on fire as I am." "And their hair, how it hisses." "Water, 1 drop of water for my youngest, he is but an infant, for my youngest, and let me burn." She paused in horrid silence, to watch the fall of a blazing rafter that was about to shatter the staircase on which she stood. "The roof has fallen on my head," she exclaimed. "The earth is weak, and all the inhabitants thereof," chaunted the weaver. "I bear up the pillars of it." The maniac marked the destruction of the spot where she thought she stood by one desperate bound, accompanied by a wild shriek, and then calmly gazed on her infants as they rolled over the scorching fragments, and sunk into the abyss of fire below. "There they go, 1, 2, 3, all," and her voice sunk into low mutterings, and her convulsions into faint, cold shudderings, like the sobbings of a spent storm, as she imagined herself to stand in safety and despair, amid the 1,000 houseless wretches assembled in the suburbs of London on the dreadful nights after the fire, without food, roof, or raiment, all gazing on the burning ruins of their dwellings and their property. She seemed to listen to their complaints, and even repeated some of them very affectingly, but invariably answered them with the same words: "But I have lost all my children, all." It was remarkable, that when this sufferer began to rave, all the others became silent. The cry of nature hushed every other cry. She was the only patient in the house who was not mad from politics, religion, ebriety, or some perverted passion, and terrifying as the outbreak of her frenzy always was, Stanton used to await it as a kind of relief from the dissonant, melancholy, and ludicrous ravings of the others. But the utmost efforts of his resolution began to sink under the continued horrors of the place. The impression on his senses began to defy the power of reason to resist them. He could not shut out these frightful cries nightly repeated, nor the frightful sound of the whip employed to still them. Hope began to fail him, as he observed, that the submissive tranquillity, which he had imagined, by obtaining increased indulgence, might contribute to his escape, or perhaps convince the keeper of his sanity, was interpreted by the callous ruffian, who was acquainted only with the varieties of madness, as a more refined species of that cunning which he was well accustomed to watch and baffle. On his first discovery of his situation, he had determined to take the utmost care of his health and intellect that the place allowed, as the sole basis of his hope of deliverance. But as that hope declined, he neglected the means of realizing it. He had at first risen early, walked incessantly about his cell, and availed himself of every opportunity of being in the open air. He took the strictest care of his person in point of cleanliness, and with or without appetite, regularly forced down his miserable meals, and all these efforts were even pleasant, as long as hope prompted them. But now he began to relax them all. He passed half the day in his wretched bed, in which he frequently took his meals, declined shaving or changing his linen, and, when the sun shone into his cell, turned from it on his straw with a sigh of heartbroken despondency. Formerly, when the air breathed through his grating, he used to say, blessed air of heaven, I shall breathe you once more in freedom. Reserve all your freshness for that delicious evening when I shall inhale you, and be as free as you myself." Now when he felt it, he sighed and said nothing. The twitter of the sparrows, the pattering of rain, or the moan of the wind, sounds that he used to sit up in his bed to catch with delight, as reminding him of nature, were now unheeded. He began at times to listen with sullen and horrible pleasure to the cries of his miserable companions. He became squalid, listless, torpid, and disgusting in his appearance. It was one of those dismal nights, that, as he tossed on his loathsome bed, more loathsome from the impossibility to quit it without feeling more unrest, he perceived the miserable light that burned in the hearth was obscured by the intervention of some dark object. He turned feebly towards the light, without curiosity, without excitement, but with a wish to diversify the monotony of his misery, by observing the slightest change made even accidentally in the dusky atmosphere of his cell. Between him and the light stood the figure of Melmoth, just as he had seen him from the first. The figure was the same, the expression of the face was the same, cold, stony, and rigid. The eyes, with their infernal and dazzling luster, were still the same. Stanton's ruling passion rushed on his soul. He felt this apparition like a summons to a high and fearful encounter. He heard his heart beat audibly, and could have exclaimed with Lee's unfortunate heroine, "It pants as cowards do before a battle. Oh, the great march has sounded." Melmoth approached him with that frightful calmness that mocks the terror it excites. "My prophecy has been fulfilled. You rise to meet me rattling from your chains, and rustling from your straw. Am I not a true prophet?" Stanton was silent. "Is not your situation very miserable?" Still Stanton was silent, for he was beginning to believe this an illusion of madness. He thought to himself, how could he have gained entrance here? "Who are you, and whence come you?" said Stanton, in a tone that was meant to be interrogatory and imperative, but which, from his habits of squalid debility, was at once feeble and querulous. His intellects had become affected by the gloom of his miserable habitation, as the wretched inmate of a similar mansion, when produced before a medical examiner, was reported to be a complete albinos. His skin was bleached, his eyes turned white, he could not bear the light, and, when exposed to it, he turned away with a mixture of weakness and restlessness, more like the writhings of a sick infant than the struggles of a man. Such was Stanton's situation. He was enfeebled now, and the power of the enemy seemed without a possibility of opposition from either his intellectual or corporeal powers. Of all their horrible dialogue, only these words were legible in the manuscript. "You know me now." "I always knew you." "That is false. You imagined you did, and that has been the cause of all the wild, of your finally being lodged in this mansion of misery, where only I would seek, where only I can succor you." "You, demon! Demon!" Harsh words! Was it a demon or a human being placed you here? Listen to me, Stanton. Nay, wrap not yourself in that miserable blanket that cannot shut out my words. Believe me, were you folded in thunderclouds, you must hear me. Stanton, think of your misery. These bare walls, what do they present to the intellect or to the senses? Whitewash, diversified with the scrawls of charcoal or red chalk that your happy predecessors have left for you to trace over. You have a taste for drawing, I trust it will improve. And here's a grating, through which the sun squints on you like a stepdame, and the breeze blows, as if it meant to tantalize you with a sigh from that sweet mouth, whose kiss you must never enjoy. And where's your library, intellectual man, traveled man, he repeated in a tone of bitter derision, where be your companions, your peaked men of countries, as your favorite Shakespeare has it? You must be content with the spider and the rat, to crawl and scratch round your flock bed. I have known prisoners in the Bastille to feed them for companions. Why don't you begin your task? I have known a spider to descend at the tap of a finger, and a rat to come forth when the daily meal was brought, to share it with his fellow prisoner. How delightful to have vermin for your guests! Aye, and when the feast fails them, they make a meal of their entertainer. You shudder, are you, then, the first prisoner who has been devoured alive by the vermin that infested his cell? Delightful banquet, not where you eat, but where you are eaten. Your guests, however, will give you one token of repentance while they feed. There will be gnashing of teeth, and you shall hear it, and feel it too perchance. And then for meals, Oh, you are daintily off. The soup that the cat has lapped, and, as her progeny has probably contributed to the hell broth, why not, then your hours of solitude, deliciously diversified by the yell of famine, the howl of madness, the crash of whips, and the broken-hearted sob of those who, like you, are supposed, or driven mad by the crimes of others. Stanton, do you imagine your reason can possibly hold out amid such scenes? Supposing your reason was unimpaired, your health not destroyed, suppose all this, which is, after all, more than fair supposition can grant, guess the effect of the continuance of these scenes on your senses alone. A time will come, and soon, when, from mere habit, you will echo the scream of every delirious wretch that harbors near you, then you will pause, clasp your hands on your throbbing head, and listen with horrible anxiety whether the scream proceeded from you or them. The time will come, when, from the want of occupation, the listless and horrible vacancy of your hours, you will feel as anxious to hear those shrieks, as you were at first terrified to hear them, when you will watch for the ravings of your next neighbor, as you would for a scene on the stage. All humanity will be extinguished in you. The ravings of these wretches will become at once your sport and your torture. You will watch for the sounds, to mock them with the grimaces and bellowings of a fiend. The mind has a power of accommodating itself to its situation that you will experience in its most frightful and deplorable efficacy. Then comes the dreadful doubt of one's own sanity, the terrible announcer that that doubt will soon become fear, and that fear certainty. Perhaps, still more dreadful, the fear will at last become a hope, shut out from society, watched by a brutal keeper, writhing with all the impotent agony of an incarcerated mind, without communication and without sympathy, unable to exchange ideas but with those whose ideas are only the hideous specters of departed intellect, or even to hear the welcome sound of the human voice, except to mistake it for the howl of a fiend, and stop the ear desecrated by its intrusion. Then at last your fear will become a more fearful hope, you will wish to become one of them, to escape the agony of consciousness. As those who have long leaned over a precipice, have at last felt a desire to plunge below, to relieve the intolerable temptation of their giddiness, you will hear them laugh amid their wildest paroxysms. You will say, doubtless those wretches have some consolation, but I have none. My sanity is my greatest curse in this abode of horrors. They greedily devour their miserable meals, while I loathe mine. They sleep sometimes soundly, while my sleep is worse than their waking. They are revived every morning by some delicious illusion of cunning madness, soothing them with the hope of escaping, baffling or tormenting their keeper. My sanity precludes all such hope. I know I never can escape, and the preservation of my faculties is only an aggravation of my sufferings. I have all their miseries, I have none of their consolations. They laugh, I hear them, would I could laugh like them. You will try, and the very effort will be an invocation to the demon of insanity to come and take full possession of you from that moment forever. There were other details, both of the menaces and temptations employed by Melmoth, which are too horrible for insertion. One of them may serve for an instance. You think that the intellectual power is something distinct from the vitality of the soul, but it was like the moan of an infant. In other words, compared to the voice which took up and re-echoed the cry, which it nearly is, in a tone that made your soul might yet enjoy beatitude in the full exercise of its enlarged and who had lost her faculties, children, and all the clouds which obscured them be dispelled by the sun of righteousness, in the dreadful fire of London, in whose beams you hope to bask forever. The cry of fire never failed to operate with terrible without going into any metaphysical subtleties about the distinction between mind and soul. She had been in a disturbed sleep, experience and now started from it as suddenly that there can be no crime into which madmen would not. It was Saturday night, precipitate themselves, and she was always observed to be particularly violent on their habit. Murder was the terrible weekly festival of their delight with her. Whether a soul in this state can be busy in a moment escaping from the flames, but she dramatized the whole scene with the loss of reason, fidelity, and reason that Stanton's resolution was far more in danger from her than from the battle between his neighbor's testimony and Listen, said the tempter. She began exclaiming she was suffocated by the smoke. Then she sprung from her bed, blasphemies might make a demon start, and appeared to be struck by the sudden glare of that puritanical preacher. The last day he imagines himself in a pulpit, denouncing damnation. The very heavens are on fire. Arminians, and even sub-lapsarians, he being a supralapsarian cried the weaver. Thou ravest of light and fire, he writhes, and yet thou art in utter darkness. You would imagine him in the hell he was painting, poor mad soul, and that the fire and brimstone he is so lavish of. The maniac never actually exhaling from his jaws. She appeared to be scrambling up a staircase. At night his creed retaliates on him. He believes himself one of the reprobates he has been all day denouncing. Her courage appeared to fail, and she retreated. He has all day been glorifying. But my children are there, she cried in a voice whom he has for 12 hours been vociferating, as she seemed to make another estimate on 10,000. Here I am, becomes the object of demoniac hostility and execration. They are all blazing. He grapples with the iron posts of his bed, and says he is rooting out the cross from the very foundations of Calvary. Any arm, and it is remarkable of my clothes, that in proportion as his morning exercises are intense, vivid, and eloquent, his nightly blasphemies are outrageous and horrible. How it hisses! Hark! Water! One drop of water for my himself youngest. A demon. He is but listen to his diabolical eloquence of horror. And let me burn. Stanton listened. She paused in horrid silence to watch the fall of the blazing raptor that was about to shatter the staircase on which she stood. Into life, liberty, the roof has fallen on my head. She exclaimed. Your social happiness, your intellectual powers, and all the inhabitants immortal interests, chaunted the weaver, depend on the choice of this moment. The maniac marked the destruction of the spot where she thought she stood by one desperate bound, accompanied by a wild shriek. And how comes the key in your hand? And then calmly gazed on her infants. And what is the condition of my liberation fragments? Said Stanton, and sunk into the abyss of fire below. The explanation occupied several pages, which, to the torture of young Melmoth, and her voice wholly illegible, low mutterings, and her convulsions into faint, however, cold shudderings, rejected by Stanton with the utmost rage and horror, as she imagined herself to stand in safety and despair, begone amid the thousand houseless wretches assembled in the suburbs of London on the dreadful nights after the fire. Even this mansion of horror trembles to contain raiment, all gazing on the burning ruins of their dwellings and their property, while you tread them. She seemed to listen to this extraordinary manuscript, and even repeated some of them very affectingly, but invariably answered them with the same words. Melmoth could hardly make out that number of lines. It was remarkable that when this sufferer began to read the calcined leaves of an Herculaneum manuscript, and hoping to discover some lost lines of Aeneas in Virgil's own patient in the house, or at least some unutterable abomination of religious or martial, or some perverted of the mysteries of the terrifying as the orgies of the frenzy always was, ever poured used to await it as a kind of relief, or shook a head of more hopeless despondency and ludicrous ravings of the others. He could but just make out what efforts of his resolution began to sink under the continued curiosity which was consuming his inmost soul. The impression on his senses began to defy the power of reason to resist but mentioned that Stanton was finally liberated from his frightful cries that his pursuit of Melmoth nor the frightful sound of the indefatigable that he himself allowed it to be a species of insanity, as that while he acknowledged it to be the master tranquility, he also felt it the master torment by obtaining increased indulgence, he again might contribute to his escape, returned to England, perhaps convinced the keeper of his sanity, was interpreted by the callous ruffian, but in vain, who was acquainted only with the varieties of madness, as a more refined species of that cunning which he was fated never to encounter again in his lifetime. On his first discovery of his situation, discovering that he had been determined to take the utmost he resolved to go there and intellect that the place allowed, found his pursuit as the sole basis of his hope of deliverance unanswered. But as that family knew nothing of him, he neglected or at least what they knew or imagined. They prudently refused to disclose to a stranger, walked incessantly about his cell, and availed himself of every opportunity of being in the open air. That he too, as appeared from many half-obliterated pages of the manuscript, cleanliness, never disclosed or without the particulars of their regularly forced down his miserable meals, and the slightest allusion to it threw him into fits of rage and gloom, as long as hope prompted and alarming. But now he left the manuscripts, however, in the hands of the family, half the day in his wretched bed, from which he frequently took his meals, their apparent indifference to their relative, changing his linen, or their obvious inacquaintance when the sun shone into his cell, manuscript on his straw with a sigh of heartbroken despondency. He seems, when the air breathed through his grating, like men, he used to say, in distress air of heaven, entrust their letters and dispatches to a bottle sealed, reserve all your freshness for that delicious evening. The last lines of the manuscript and be as free as you myself were sufficiently extraordinary. Now when he felt it, he sighed and said nothing. The desire of meeting him once more, the pattering of rain, become as a burning fire within me. Sounds it is the necessary condition of my existence with delight, as reminding him of nature. Sought him at last in Ireland, of which I find he began at times to listen with sullen and horrible pleasure to the cries of his miserable companions. Such was the conclusion of the manuscript which Melmoth found in his uncle's closet, and disgusting when he had finished it. He sunk down on the table near which he had been reading it, that, his face tossed on his loathsome bed, his senses reeling from the impossibility to quit it without feeling more unrest. He perceived the miserable light that burned in the heart was obscured by the involuntary some dark object, and saw the picture gazing at him from its canvas towards the light. Without he was within 10 inches of without it as excitement, and but with a wish to diversify the monotony of his misery, that was by observing the slightest change made it being the only representation of a human figure in the room. Between him and the light stood the figure were about to receive an explanation from its lips. The figure was the same, the expression of the face was the same, cold, stony, and rigid. The eyes, with their infernal and dazzling luster, were still the same. Stanton's ruling passion rushed on his soul. He felt this apparition like a summons to a high and fearful encounter. He heard his heart beat audibly, and could have exclaimed with Lee's unfortunate heroine, "It pants as cowards do before a battle. Oh, the great march has sounded." Melmoth approached him with that frightful calmness that mocks the terror it excites. "My prophecy has been fulfilled. You rise to meet me rattling from your chains, and rustling from your straw. Am I not a true prophet?" Stanton was silent. "Is not your situation very miserable?" Still Stanton was silent, for he was beginning to believe this an illusion of madness. He thought to himself, how could he have gained entrance here? He gazed on it in return. All was silent in the house. They were alone together. The illusion subsided at length, and as the mind rapidly passes to opposite extremes, he remembered the injunction of his uncle to destroy the portrait. He seized it. His hand shook at first, but the moldering canvas appeared to assist him in the effort. He tore it from the frame with a cry half terrific, half triumphant. It fell at his feet, and he shuddered as it fell. He expected to hear some fearful sounds, some unimaginable breathings of prophetic horror, follow this act of sacrilege, for such he felt it, to tear the portrait of his ancestor from his native walls. He paused and listened. There was no voice, nor any that answered, but as the wrinkled and torn canvas fell to the floor, its undulations gave the portrait the appearance of smiling. Melmoth felt horror indescribable at this transient and imaginary resuscitation of the figure. He caught it up, rushed into the next room, tore, cut, and hacked it in every direction, and eagerly watched the fragments that burned like tinder in the turf fire which had been lit in his room. As Melmoth saw the last blaze, he threw himself into bed, in hope of a deep and intense sleep. He had done what was required of him, and felt exhausted both in mind and body, but his slumber was not so sound as he had hoped for. The sullen light of the turf fire, burning but never blazing, disturbed him every moment. He turned and turned, but still there was the same red light glaring on, but not illuminating, the dusky furniture of the apartment. The wind was high that night, and as the creaking door swung on its hinges, every noise seemed like the sound of a hand struggling with the lock, or of a foot pausing on the threshold. But, for Melmoth never could decide, was it in a dream or not, that he saw the figure of his ancestor appear at the door? Hesitatingly as he saw him at first on the night of his uncle's death, saw him enter the room, approach his bed, and heard him whisper, "You have burned me, then, but those are flames I can survive. I am alive, I am beside you." Melmoth started, sprung from his bed. It was broad daylight. He looked round. There was no human being in the room but himself. He felt a slight pain in the wrist of his right arm. He looked at it. It was black and blue, as from the recent grip of a strong hand.